The Deadly Neighbor. My family and I moved into a house in the suburbs, and the neighbors seemed friendly until I met Mara. She happened to be the neighbor next door, and my mom quickly befriended her. At first, she seemed kind and friendly, often visiting my mom for coffee chats, but there was something unsettling about her. One afternoon, Mara visited us. She and my mom were chatting on the balcony, and I don't know why I was there. Probably out of boredom, but I sat with them. Before my mom stood up to get a cake she had just baked, I was still sitting at the table with Mara, and that's when my life might have changed forever. Mara was a ghostly-looking woman, thin with long black hair and unnaturally large yellow eyes. Her eyes were so unnatural that maintaining eye contact for more than 3 seconds felt impossible. We sat in silence until she suddenly turned toward me, a creepy smile spreading across her face. She began tilting her head slowly from side to side, almost like a puppet, and then said, "Are you ready to go now, little one?" I froze in place. Her voice had changed significantly. There was something darker about it. She began pulling out a black rose from her purse, an odd-looking flower, and held it out toward me. It was the first time I'd ever seen a black rose, and I started sweating from fear. Before I could react, my mom returned with the tray of cake, and Mara suddenly reverted to normal, as if someone flipped a switch. She quietly placed the black rose back into her purse, her face expressionless, and my mom didn't notice. I left the balcony, trying to dismiss the encounter, but something inside me knew that she was no ordinary neighbor. At night, my room was on the ground floor, and my window was high up. To be honest, I was never an easily frightened kid, but that night, I didn't know why, a strange feeling flooded my mind. I kept tossing and turning, nervously checking and peeking out the window every 5 minutes. Finally, as I began to drift off, I decided to look out the window one last time to ease my mind. But to my horror, Mara was standing at my window, the faint moonlight illuminating her smudged, grinning lips, just like the eerie smile I had seen on her face earlier that afternoon. I began walking toward the door with trembling legs, sweat pouring down like rain. As I kept moving, Mara's sinister yellow eyes followed me in slow, puppet-like motions. I reached for the doorknob, but then she raised the black rose again and muttered those eerie words. "I hope you're ready now." I screamed, "Please leave me alone." The moment I said that, her smile disappeared, replaced by an angry scowl as she shook her head side to side in disapproval. Then the worst happened. Mara was trying to get inside. She gripped the window frame and began slamming herself against it with both hands. Horrified, I watched as the window slid open, and she began pushing her head through the gap. Mara's body twisted unnaturally, like a puppet manipulated by invisible strings. Panicking, I grabbed the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. It was stuck. I couldn't open the door. She was almost inside. I heard her laughter, a sound that sent terror coursing through my veins. "You will come with me. You will be my last one." Suddenly, the door opened, and I bolted out of the room, screaming for my dad. He was a light sleeper, and when I burst into his room, he jumped out of bed in a panic. All I could say was, "Mara, the window." You know how people vanish when someone else comes? The same happened to me. I caught a glimpse of Mara leaving. I saw her in the distance, disappearing into the shadows beyond a house as the faint glow of lights passed over her. But my dad didn't see her. He checked the window, but Mara was gone. The next morning, I woke up to see police cars parked outside Mara's house. They were murmuring that the police had found something horrific inside her home. I was grateful to be alive. They had found innocent lives, 4 children's bodies buried in her backyard. With each body, she had buried a black rose, as if part of some dark ritual. And I might have been the last one. To this day, I wake up at night drenched in sweat, terrified that Mara is standing near my bed, tilting her head to the left with that same malicious smile, whispering, "You will come with me." The Bloody Delivery. A quiet, secluded suburban neighborhood with winding streets and houses far apart. My name is Nick, and I'm just a pizza delivery guy trying to make a living. Tonight is cold and rainy, the kind of night where windshield wipers have to work overtime. I've been driving these streets for months now, delivering pizzas to people who barely acknowledge me. It's just a job, nothing special. But tonight, I stopped at the same old house. The house that always orders pizza at the strangest hours. It's so remote and isolated. It feels like it belongs to another universe. I've been here so many times I've lost count, but there's always been something off about it. I parked in front of the isolated house at the edge of town, stopping at the end of the gravel driveway, headlights illuminating the crumbling porch. The house looked like it hadn't been cared for in years. Overgrown grass, dusty windows, darkened by old curtains swaying in the wind. I took a deep breath, grabbed the pizza box, and stepped up to the front door, knocking on the heavy wooden frame that echoed loudly. For a moment, nothing. Then, the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her faint smile barely lighting up her pale face, illuminated by dim light from inside. Yet her eyes were distant, unfocused, shadowed. "Here's your pizza," I said cheerfully, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. She reached out for the pizza box, her hand extending. But something about her hand caught my eye. As I handed it to her, I noticed bruises, dark, swollen marks on her pale skin, as if they'd been there for days. I froze for a second, standing there, unsure if I should say something, but decided against it. I quickly withdrew my hand and forced a smile. "Thanks," she mumbled, almost robotic, before pulling the pizza box inside and shutting the door. I got back in my car and sat for a moment, thinking. The rain kept pouring, and the world outside felt heavy. I couldn't shake the image of her trembling hand as she took the pizza box from me. But I drove away, trying to push it out of my mind. It was just a strange coincidence, I told myself. Weeks passed. Same routine. I delivered pizza to the same house every few days. I started to feel uneasy, my curiosity growing. One evening, after handing her the pizza, I hesitated and asked, "Excuse me? May I ask something?" But the woman only smiled faintly, shook her head, and closed the door, leaving me unsettled. Each time, the bruises and scratches on her hands seemed worse, this time even on her face, as if they had just healed and then reappeared. My instincts told me something was very wrong. Tonight, there was no regular order, but then I noticed something strange, a note hastily written in black ink, taped to the door. It read, "Deliver to the back door. Knock 3 times, hard." I followed the instructions. This time, it wasn't her but a man. He stood there, bloodshot eyes, clearly intoxicated, his breath reeking of alcohol. He didn't say a word, just glared at me. I instinctively stepped back, trying to keep calm. He reached for the pizza box, snatched it from my hands, stepped inside and slammed the door shut. I left quickly. One evening, I drove past the house again, not to deliver this time, just passing by after my shift. My curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced at the house. In the second-floor window, a figure appeared behind the curtain, flashing a light 3 times, repeatedly, over and over. But then, I saw the shadow of a man behind her, raising his hand as if ready to strike. I froze for a moment. I sat in my car, unable to take my eyes off the house. Something inside me told me I needed to go back. I didn't know what would happen next, but I couldn't ignore it. She needed help. After some thought, I returned to the house, planning to make up an excuse, saying it was a promotional gift for loyal customers. I felt I needed to see the woman again to make sure she was okay. The woman opened the door to pay, her eyes darting down to her hand as if she was deciding whether to say something. I followed her gaze. Then, her hand slowly moved down in an unusual way. She folded her thumb into her palm, then folded all her fingers down. At first, I didn't understand, but then I remembered learning about warning signals. It was the SOS hand signal for help. Before I could react or ask her what was happening, the man appeared behind her and shoved her back. He was still drunk, stumbling toward me with a dark, menacing expression. This time, his face had a fresh scratch, and his clothes were smeared with something unidentifiable, speckled with tiny dark spots. The man looked disoriented, his bloodshot eyes moving sluggishly. He mumbled something incoherent and slammed the door shut. At that moment, I froze in hesitation, unsure if this was my responsibility and whether I was putting myself in danger. Just as I was about to leave, the woman screamed from inside the house. "Help! Please!" Her voice was filled with fear. I dropped the pizza box, instincts kicking in, and rushed through the door without hesitation, quickly moving into the house. I knew a bit about self-defense. I had trained in martial arts for situations like this. As I stepped inside, a scene of chaos unfolded. It was horrifying. She was pinned to the floor, struggling under the man's weight, her face wet with tears, and her hands partially bound. Before I could move, the man charged at me in a fit of rage. But I anticipated the attack, ducked low, and countered with a strong strike to his side, sending him crashing to the floor in pain. Seizing the moment, I pinned him to the floor and used the rope he was tying the woman with to restrain him temporarily, long enough to keep him away from her. He was arrested shortly after, and the truth behind that house came to light. Her name was Angela. The man was her ex-husband. The two had gone through a court-ordered divorce. After she refused to reconcile with him, he kidnapped and tortured her, planning to force her into submission. His recent behavior was the result of a psychotic episode. His obsession turned deadly when she tried to escape. After the incident, I decided to quit my job, unwilling to continue such a dangerous line of work. Angela is now living a happy life with her daughter and her new husband. The Uber driver's nightmare trip. The Uber nightmare, it was just another night on the job. Not that I enjoyed these late shifts, but my rent was due in a week, and I'd already spent all my money on new tires and an oil change. I had been driving every night. I really hated driving at night. The fog, the isolation, it always gave me chills. I had just dropped off a drunk couple from a bar when my phone buzzed, signaling the next ride. As I drove to pick up my next passenger, I noticed it was the exact spot where I had picked up the couple just half an hour earlier. I figured it was just a strange coincidence. I stopped at the pickup location but didn't see anyone. The fog had thickened, as if swallowing the entire street. I honked the horn and glanced around to see if anyone was coming, but there was no one. I quickly checked my phone to confirm the pickup spot on the app. Just as I was about to double-check the app, my back door suddenly opened, and my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I let out a nervous laugh, even feeling a little embarrassed. It was a man. He didn't say a word as he got in and sat down, clutching a brown paper bag tightly. There was something unsettling about the way he held that bag. After a moment, he told me he knew the couple I had just dropped off. Then, he asked me to take him to the same location where I'd dropped them off earlier. I keyed in the address and started driving. A few miles down the road, my phone buzzed, and I nearly jumped. I got a notification from Uber that someone else wanted to be picked up along the way. It was odd, considering it was past 3 in the morning. I arrived at the new pickup location, and she was standing beneath a streetlight, making her easy to spot. She ran toward the passenger seat, and instinctively, I unlocked the door for her to sit up front. With the man in the back seat, I didn't want to take any chances. I turned away and focused on driving. I glanced at her again. There was something about the way she looked at the man in the back seat, as if they shared a connection, but weren't saying it out loud. We drove in silence. I checked the map. All 3 of them were headed to the same address where I'd dropped off the couple earlier. My mind started racing. What's going on? Why is she going there too? Then I curiously asked, "So, do you all know each other?" She smiled, turned to me, and nodded. "Yes," she said with absolute confidence. When we arrived at the address, I noticed all the lights were off. They began walking toward the house, and before leaving, the woman turned back and said, "Just wait here for a minute. We'll be right back." Both disappeared into the darkness. I stared ahead and sat there for a few minutes, wondering for a moment, should I just leave? Suddenly, there was a loud bang on my car window. She yelled, "Please, hurry, hurry. My friend needs help. We need your help to get her to the hospital." I tried to shake off the fear in my mind and got out of the car to follow her. When we reached the door, the man slammed it shut behind me. He shoved me to the ground, and I saw the knife in his hand. The woman's voice changed, her calm demeanor replaced by a cruel laugh. She slowly turned to me and told me to run while laughing maniacally. I crawled as quickly as I could to the dining room, and I couldn't believe my eyes, the couple I had dropped off an hour ago. But they were no longer alive. The man was now behind me. He was so close. I ran as fast as I could. Luckily, he slipped, giving me just enough time to sprint up the stairs. I wedged myself into a closet, trying to suppress my sobs. I wasn't sure how long I could stay hidden. Then I suddenly realized there was a figure, a woman, standing in front of the closet. Perhaps the blood trail on the floor had given me away. I hesitated, but saw she was alone outside. I took a chance, shoved the door open, and knocked her to the ground. I hurried to the window without hesitation. I smashed the glass, breaking it, and climbed out. Pain shot through my arm, but I ignored it. I couldn't go back. I just ran, got into my car, and drove straight to the police station. My efforts paid off. The next morning, investigators uncovered the full extent of the killer's crimes. Dozens of drivers had been lured to their deaths in the same way I had been. They had used ride-sharing services as a cover, abducting innocent victims one by one, all for their dark purposes. This ruthless duo had evaded capture many times, but not this time. They were arrested. I felt incredibly lucky because, as far as I knew, most people didn't survive. The nightmare, it seemed, had finally ended. Message on the mirror. Lily was living in an old apartment, a temporary home. The unique feature of the apartment was the mirrors. They reflected every corner of the space. Some were framed with antique designs, while others appeared worn and aged. Although Lily found them beautiful, they sometimes exuded a strange, unsettling feeling. Lily sat on the couch, reading a book. The apartment was enveloped in silence. Suddenly, Lily stopped. She heard footsteps. She sat still, listening. The sound continued, but when she looked around the room, no one was there. She shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. Lily got up and glanced at the mirrors along the hallway. In the dim light, each mirror reflected her image, but with a strange distortion. A slight chill ran down her spine, but she ignored it. Lily stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The overhead light flickered as she washed her face. but she stopped when she saw something strange in the reflection. There was a shadow, resembling a man, pressed against the window. His face was obscured, but the outline of his body was unmistakable. Lily quickly turned around, but the bathroom was empty. A wave of fear washed over her. The unsettling feeling grew stronger. At night, she felt she wasn't alone, as if someone was standing just outside her line of sight, watching her. One night, just before bed, she went to the living room to watch TV. Then the feeling returned. She was tense, filled with fear, unsure if she was imagining it. But she saw it, a hand sliding past the curtain. Lily cautiously stood up and turned to look. The curtain swayed, but there was nothing behind it. Her breathing quickened, and a cold, heavy sensation filled the room. Then suddenly, from behind her, a shadow emerged from the darkness. It was unmistakably the figure of a man. He wore filthy, tattered clothes, his face gaunt and pale. He said nothing, only stared at Lily as if waiting for her to act. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to move toward the door. Lily ran down the hallway. She reached the front door, fumbling with the lock. She glanced back to see the man's eyes, filled with amusement, a satisfied smile on his face as he watched her every move. She struggled to open the door, bursting out into the night, gasping for air. Her legs gave out as she stumbled down the stairs. She stood at the building's entrance, breathing heavily, asking for help from those around. They helped her call the police. The police arrived within minutes and stormed into the apartment. She told them about the man, about what she had seen inside, but they seemed skeptical. Everything in the apartment was untouched, and nothing was missing. There were no signs of forced entry. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The red and blue lights of the police cars flashed across the old building, leaving her alone once again. Lily stood outside, unable to bring herself to go back inside. She looked up at her apartment window, and for a moment, she thought she saw a faint figure standing there. Watching her from behind the glass, she shivered, knowing she couldn't stay there any longer. It was time to pack up and leave for good. A few days later, she returned to the house. Lily stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath. She was here one last time to gather her belongings before leaving this strange place forever. Message on the mirror. The hallway seemed darker than before. The dim lights flickered weakly as she walked down the narrow corridor, her footsteps echoing faintly. Lily paused for a moment before the door, hesitating as her hand hovered over the doorknob. Then she slowly opened the door and stepped inside. The familiar chill hit her as she entered the apartment. She was ready to leave this place behind. As she walked through the living room, she caught a glimpse of herself in one of the mirrors. Her reflection looked almost unfamiliar, distorted by the unease she felt. Lily looked away, trying to focus on packing her belongings. Walking down the hallway, she came across an old mirror covered in dust, one she had never noticed before. It sat at the end of the hallway, almost forgotten beneath its dusty covering. She moved closer to the mirror. It was coated with a thick layer of dust, but something about it drew her attention. Slowly, she pulled the cloth away. She shuddered at what she saw. Written faintly in the dust on the mirror were the words, "Hello," and just below it, "I like you." Lily held her breath as she stared at the mirror. Had it always been there? She tried to reason with herself, convincing herself. It must have been there for a long time. She shook her head, trying to ignore the growing paranoia. Lily went into the bedroom, hastily gathering her belongings to pack and leave. As she passed the bathroom, a sudden chill ran down her spine. She stopped, slowly turning her head to look inside. Lily's heart skipped a beat. The bathroom sink faucet was running. She was certain she hadn't left it on. She cautiously stepped into the bathroom, her eyes fixed on the mirror. A message appeared on the fogged glass. "You are mine." Lily froze in terror. She had heard horror stories about people secretly living in others' homes. Was she unknowingly a victim? Trembling, she reached out to turn off the faucet. Slowly, she extended her hand and touched the surface of the mirror. She was shocked to feel a small latch, and the mirror suddenly moved, swinging open like a door. Lily staggered backward as the mirror revealed a hidden space behind it, larger and darker than she could have ever imagined. Then her heart nearly stopped. A face emerged from the darkness. It was a man, his hair disheveled, his wide eyes and a toothy grin, the shadows seemingly swallowing his body, making him appear as just a floating head. Below, the floor was cluttered with clothes, various trash, and some personal belongings. Panic surged through her. Lily turned, grabbed her keys, and bolted out of the bathroom. Lily burst through the front door of the building. She ran to her car, slammed the door shut, locked it, and called the police. The police arrived quickly. The man was eventually caught, still wearing that unnerving, unnatural smile. The police searched the apartment. They discovered a hidden space behind the bathroom mirror containing personal items, canned food, and things Lily recognized as her own. The man had been living there, watching her, moving around the apartment whenever she was out. When they apprehended him, he refused to explain or answer any questions from the police, sometimes sulking, other times aggressive, appearing mentally unstable. Lily felt incredibly lucky that the man was merely an agitated intruder and not a murderer. Otherwise, things could have been far worse. She started the car, glancing at the apartment one last time. Then she drove away, leaving the apartment and its horrors behind. The shadow of an eccentric person. Maggie had been staying at her friend's apartment in this remote town for the past few weeks. The old apartment was the perfect escape for her from the chaos of life. But the peace she sought was quickly overshadowed by an odd, unsettling feeling that seemed to linger in the walls. Lily moved around the living room, tidying up a bit. She noticed there were quite a few mirrors hanging on the walls, as her friend was a collector of mirrors. But those mirrors gave her an inescapable feeling that they held something more. As she passed by one of the mirrors, for a brief moment, she felt as though something, or someone, was staring at her. She wasn't sure and brushed it off. Maybe it was just her imagination. She picked up a few scattered items from the coffee table and walked down the hallway to the bathroom. That night, Lily prepared to take a bath. She was tired and wanted to relax, to forget the strange feeling creeping into her thoughts. She turned on the faucet to fill the bathtub, steam filling the room. But as she was waiting for the tub to fill, her eyes suddenly caught sight of the mirror above the sink. She felt as if something was moving. Maggie startled, turning around, but there was no one in the room. The air was heavy with silence. A shiver ran down her spine, and she quickly exited the bathroom, her thoughts spinning. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing, just stress from being alone in a strange place. One night, as she was about to drift off to sleep, she noticed a noise, or something moving. A shadow was cast on the floor. She felt an unease unlike anything she'd ever experienced. She didn't dare move. Her anxiety grew. Suddenly, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. Maggie turned, opened her eyes, and there he was, a tall, pale, gaunt man with sunken eyes standing right behind her. Maggie jumped up, rushed to turn on the bedside lamp, but her hand slipped, and she knocked it over. As the lights flickered, the room lit up intermittently, but she couldn't see anyone. Then everything didn't stop. Shortly after, she heard a soft tapping on the window behind her. Maggie hesitated, then gathered her courage and opened the curtain, but there was no one there. She panicked. It felt like a staged prank, as though something terrible was happening. She tried once again to shake it off and left the bedroom, but she didn't realize a man had appeared, standing silently, staring at her. He didn't move, just stared at her with eerie stillness. Days passed, and she began losing track of time, her mental state deteriorating. The reflection of the man started appearing more often, sometimes standing motionless at the end of the hallway. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow at the end of the hallway. For the first time, he physically appeared, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes, dressed in filthy, tattered clothes. Fear consumed her as she backed into the corner of the room. He was slowly approaching, his face twisted into a sinister grin. In horror, he lunged at her. Maggie was shoved into the large mirror, shattering it into a cacophony of sharp, piercing noise. As she fought back, the man screamed,
"You will be mine."
He gripped her wrists tightly, but in the chaos, he momentarily lost focus, distracted by his own delusions. Desperate to free herself, Maggie grabbed a shard of broken glass and, with all her strength, stabbed his hand. He howled in pain and released her. Maggie seized the moment of his distraction to escape. She ran out of the apartment, calling for help from anyone nearby. Soon, the police surrounded the apartment, and he was captured. He was an abnormal, deranged individual who had been living in an abandoned house nearby for years. He was arrested and placed in a psychiatric facility after being diagnosed with severe mental instability and a history of violent behavior. The police believed he had been stalking Maggie for weeks before his outburst. Even though he was captured, she couldn't shake the feeling that the mirrors in the house still reflected something strange. The trauma lingered within her, and it would take a long time for her to recover. The deadly chase. A dark, secluded house appears on a quiet street, hidden by dense trees. In the dimly lit room, Emma and Nick visit the home of a new friend they met recently. His name is Gavi. They sit close, laughing and chatting together. Nick yawns, his eyes drooping, looking unusually tired. Emma notices but brushes it off, thinking he's just weary from drinking a little. Eventually, he mumbles that he needs to lie down. Emma watches him stagger into the living room, nearly stumbling, and starts to feel a bit concerned. But she doesn't notice Gavi's gaze, different from hers. His eyes follow Nick, watching with a look of satisfaction and pleasure. Left alone with Gavi, Emma feels a tense unease she can't put into words. Then he stares at her as he steps closer, his gaze cold and intense. She awkwardly avoids his gaze. Suddenly, he says, "So, let's play hide and seek." Emma feels a bit puzzled, but agrees to ease the awkwardness. Gavi's eyes remain fixed on her, darkening with something unreadable. Emma moves into the dim living room, deciding to play along, hiding under the bed. She tries to stifle a giggle, convincing herself it's just a game. Then, she hears Gavi's voice echo down the hall, his voice husky. "The time limit is 20 minutes. If I find you within that time, you'll be mine." Emma's smile fades, his words linger in her mind, and suddenly, she feels a sense of unease. She continues the game, opening the door to a dark bedroom and slipping inside. Emma crawls under the bed to hide. A sudden crash shatters the silence. The sound of breaking glass echoes down the hallway, and her unease grows with each second. She hears footsteps and objects breaking. Something heavy is being dragged, coming closer. Emma lies still, feeling strangely anxious despite knowing it's just a game. Then she hears his voice from the hallway. "You better hide well, or it won't be fun." As she's about to leave, a hammer suddenly strikes the door. Emma nearly screams in surprise, but she stifles it, covering her mouth with both hands. Then he kicked open the door and entered the room, breathing heavily and holding a massive hammer. Emma started to shiver. Was he just playing? A whirlwind of thoughts disturbed her mind. Then, after a moment, Gavi slowly swung the hammer with all his might at the cabinet. Wood splintered with a loud crack, and the wardrobe door burst open. He muttered to himself as he checked inside, then said, "Oh, she's not here too bad. If she had been hit, it would have been quite a show." Emma watched in terror as he moved, each step bringing him closer to her hiding spot. She slowly realized that this was no joke, and he was a madman. Then he lifted the hammer slowly again and circled around. Under the bed, Emma watched him move. A moment later, he stood in front of the bed. With frightening speed, Gavi ripped the mattress off the bed frame, exposing Emma's hiding spot. She froze, staring at him as he raised the hammer, eyes wide with excitement. Then he smashed the hammer into the bed frame, splintering the wood, the hammer landing inches from Emma's head. He yelled, staring through the gap at Emma, saying in sick amusement that he had missed. Emma screamed, crawling out and frantically running out of the room, with him following, dragging the hammer along the wall, his laughter echoing throughout the house. He was close behind her when suddenly the timer went off. He stopped, looked at the clock and said, "Time's up. Let's play another round." Her entire body shaking, she immediately bolted. Emma left his house, jumped into her car, and drove off, calling the police right away. They arrived at his house. When they searched, a sound came from the closet. Cautiously opening it, he lunged out, swinging the hammer wildly at the officers, injuring some severely. At that moment, Gavi was shot dead by the police on the spot, and they discovered horrific things. In his house, they found Nick dead, along with several others who had met the same fate: pale faces, sedative effects, and terrifying injuries. Gavi's guests were forced to play a twisted game, with only a few lucky ones, like Emma, chosen to survive. The unlucky ones were marked, sedated, and ultimately killed in his final sick game, which satisfied his perverse desires. Intruder from the garage. It was just another long, dull day at school, but as I walked home, the excitement of Friday lightened my mood. No school tomorrow. I could finally relax. As I approached my house, I noticed something odd. The garage door was wide open, and the light inside was still on. My dad had left earlier that day for a business trip, so he must have been in a hurry and forgot to close it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I stepped into the garage, turned off the light, and pulled the door shut. The quiet of the house greeted me as I stepped inside, and the thought of having the entire place to myself made me feel free. My mom had gone to a friend's house for the evening, so I was all set for a night of gaming and movies. Hours passed as I got lost in my game. The house was silent, except for the occasional sounds from the TV. I decided to grab a drink, and as I walked into the kitchen, something caught my attention. The garage light was on again. I froze, a strange, eerie feeling creeping over me. Did I forget to turn it off? Or had my mom come back? But I didn't hear her come in. My heart began to race as I approached the garage door, my steps growing heavier. The moment I stepped into the garage, I saw that every drawer in my dad's workshop area was open. His tools were scattered across the floor, as if someone had been frantically searching for something. But no one was there. I hurried back inside, locking the garage door behind me. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I started heading back to the living room, planning to watch TV and try to calm myself down. Then, from behind me, I heard the garage door handle rattling violently. I froze, staring at the door, watching it shake harder and harder, as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, as I realized I needed to get out of the house. In my panic, I didn't notice that the noise had suddenly stopped. The silence was eerie, too silent. I ran straight for the front door, my only thought being to escape. But as I entered the living room, I froze in my tracks. Someone was there, a large man, his back turned to me. In his hand, he gripped an axe tightly. It must have been taken from my dad's workshop. I held my breath, terrified that he would turn around and see me. The TV was still playing, masking my footsteps, and I knew this was my only chance. Going upstairs was not an option. I quietly turned back and headed for the back door, trying to stay calm. Once outside, I didn't stop running. I hurried across to my neighbor's house. Panicked, I banged on their door until they let me in. I waited there, staring at my house from across the street, praying the intruder wouldn't come looking for me. I pounded on my neighbor's door, and it felt like hours before Mr. Thompson finally opened it, his face etched with confusion. I told him everything that had happened. Mr. Thompson, a retired firefighter with a strong sense of duty, grabbed a flashlight and an old baseball bat. He assured me he would check the house and that everything would be fine. Reluctantly, I stayed behind, watching him cross the street. My body was still shaking with fear. My anxiety grew as I watched, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. I had called the police. They were on their way, but the thought of that man in my house, wielding my dad's axe, haunted me. I watched as Mr. Thompson cautiously approached the front door, shining his flashlight across the windows and garage. He disappeared inside. I strained to listen for anything, but everything was eerily silent. Suddenly, I saw him step outside. From across the street, his voice echoed faintly. "There's no one in there. The house is empty." A wave of relief washed over me, but I knew I still needed to stay cautious. As Mr. Thompson began walking back toward me, that gnawing sense of unease returned. Before I could voice my concern, a shadow moved behind him. My blood ran cold. The intruder. He was there, emerging from the dark side of the house, the axe glinting faintly under the porch light. I screamed, trying to warn Mr. Thompson, but it was too late. As he turned, the man lunged at him. A fierce struggle broke out. Mr. Thompson swung the baseball bat, but the intruder was strong. The two grappled, the axe coming dangerously close to Mr. Thompson's head as they stumbled across the lawn. My legs wouldn't move, paralyzed with fear, as I watched the horrifying scene unfold. Each second felt like a nightmare. Mr. Thompson managed a strong swing with the bat, striking the man's ribs, but it wasn't enough. The intruder roared in pain, but instead of retreating, he raised the axe, ready to strike. Just as the axe came down, Mr. Thompson threw himself to the side, narrowly dodging the blow. In that brief moment of distraction, Mr. Thompson delivered another blow, knocking the man off balance. I finally decided to rush forward to help, but before I could reach them, the sound of police sirens echoed in the air. He looked up at the sound of the sirens and, using his last ounce of strength, bolted toward the backyard. Mr. Thompson staggered to his feet, gasping for air but still steady. The police arrived just in time, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they chased after the man. Within minutes, they subdued him. The man thrashed violently, growling like a wild animal, but the police swiftly restrained him, pinning him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. I stood there, trembling, watching the entire scene unfold. Mr. Thompson approached me, clutching his side where he had been hit, but still managing a smile. "It's safe now," he said. I felt an overwhelming gratitude for being saved. I recounted every detail I could remember to the police, but all I wanted was to forget. I sat down on the steps of Mr. Thompson's porch, my body trembling, watching the man sitting in the back of the police car as it drove away. It was over, but the image of the intruder's face, his crazed eyes, and the sound of the axe slicing through the air would haunt me forever. Mr. Thompson sat next to me, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing, kid," he said softly. "It's over now." But deep down, I knew the fear would stay with me. I would never forget how close I came to being caught in the grip of something truly evil. The murderer on Christmas night. Christmas is usually a time of peace and joy, but sometimes it's when the strangest and most terrifying things can happen. The story is about when I was a child. At that time, to be honest, Christmas wasn't my favorite holiday. Sure, the gifts, food, and Santa Claus were great, but somehow, all of that always felt empty to me. While everyone was gathered talking, I went to the dining room to play alone, and that's when everything started. At that time, I thought maybe I had watched too many horror movies, but I swear I saw someone through the window. A shadow passed by the window, just for a second. It was a person, but their face wasn't normal. The man wore a grotesque, demon-like mask. I froze in place. I moved closer to the window to see better, but there was nothing there. I thought maybe it was just my imagination. Then, suddenly, the man lunged forward with the mask, his mouth twisted into a wide, grotesque grin. He gently tapped on the window and pointed at the front door. After that, he moved away from the window and walked toward the front door. A few seconds later, someone began knocking on the door. I ran to warn my dad, but he brushed it off, thinking it was just Uncle Henry bringing in beer. He even joked that I was probably imagining everything because I was bored. My dad hesitated as he stepped toward the door, reluctantly opening it. It was Uncle Henry, which confused me even more. I didn't know what was going on. Despite Uncle Henry's comforting presence, the strange feeling I had didn't go away. I didn't know what to say anymore. I was scared, but my dad seemed to think it was just a prank. My body trembled as I went back upstairs, locked the door, and shoved a chair under the doorknob, trapping myself in my room, trying to escape the growing fear inside me. As night fell, and the family gathered outside to watch the fireworks, I stayed inside, staring out of my bedroom window at the bright lights. Suddenly, someone began knocking on my room door. I was about to open it when I realized something was wrong. I looked back out the window. My mom, dad, grandparents, and uncle were all downstairs. So, who was knocking on the door? I stepped toward the door, my hand trembling as I touched the doorknob. I paused for a second, then looked through the peephole. It wasn't my parents. It was him, the man wearing the demon mask. His voice was deep, but I could still hear it clearly. There was no mistaking it. He insisted that I let him in, promising me horrors if I refused. He even taunted me, threatening to kill me like he had with other children. Terrified, the first refused to open the door, only to hear the door starting to splinter as the masked man tried to break in. I screamed for help, but they outside didn't know the danger lurking inside. In a desperate attempt to cry for help, at the same time, my parents struggled to open the locked back door, which had been mysteriously sealed from the inside. They were panicked, unable to get into the house. As the masked man continued pounding on the door, I watched in horror as the wood began to crack. He was close to getting in, and I could feel my life slipping away. The door shattered, and the man, his face still hidden behind the grotesque demon mask, stepped into the room. He grabbed my neck with terrifying strength. My body writhed, trying to escape his grip. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought this was it. But then, a loud crash sounded from outside the window. He looked up for a moment, distracted. My dad realized the severity of the situation, climbed the ladder to the window, and threw a rock through it. The glass shattered. Without hesitation, my dad climbed through the broken window and rushed into the room just in time to pull him away. He didn't stop there, though. He took a knife and lunged toward my dad. My dad tried to dodge the strike, but the blade grazed his shoulder painfully. Still, he pushed forward. As my dad desperately fought to subdue him, I grabbed a metal lamp from the bedside table and struck him on the head. He staggered back, dazed. Outside, the sound of sirens could finally be heard. We were saved at last. When they caught the man, he referred to himself as the Grinch. They said he was responsible for many child disappearances around my age, and some bodies had been found and buried in his backyard. Since that day, many months later, I still see a therapist because of that man. Every time I sleep, I dream about what would have happened if I hadn't locked my door. I survived, yes, but the nightmares will never leave me. The kidnapper's scary plan. Lily was on her way home from her best friend Emma's house. Emma's house was on a hill, and despite Emma urging Lily to stay over, she decided to head home. It was only 7:30 p.m., and she decided to take the bus. At the nearby bus stop, she arrived and saw a man already sitting there. He looked a bit strange, appearing to be homeless. The man's unsettling presence made Lily uncomfortable. She decided to keep her distance and stood there with a serious expression. Emma called her to ask if she had boarded the bus yet. Lily talked to her for a while, trying to ease the discomfort caused by the man's presence. Despite trying to ignore him, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching her. Every 5 to 10 seconds, he would take out his phone and appear busy texting. After ending the call, Lily glanced at her phone. It was 7:45 p.m., and her battery was down to 10%. She sighed, annoyed that she hadn't charged it earlier. She stared at the long, empty highway, but there was no sign of the bus. She felt uneasy being alone with the strange man. Then the man stood up from his seat and started walking toward Lily. She looked away, trying to focus on her phone screen as he approached her.
Hey, got a lighter?
Without looking up, Lily curtly replied.
I don't smoke.
She could hear him moving behind her, but didn't dare to turn around. A moment later, she turned around, and he was standing right in front of her. His eyes stared at her vacantly, and his smile was eerie, grotesque.
Are you sure? All girls pretend they don't like attention, but they all love it.
Leave me alone.
She yelled loudly, threatening that if he didn't back off, she would scream and call the police, warning him that her friend's house was nearby and her friend's dad owned a gun. His smile vanished, and she thought she was safe. Then headlights appeared as a car pulled up, driven by an older woman who offered Lily a ride. Surprised but not hesitating, Lily seized the chance to escape the unsettling situation. She quickly got into the car without a second thought, leaving the man behind. As the car drove away, Lily saw the man smiling in the rearview mirror, and his expression sent chills down her spine. They drove off, and the woman smiled as Lily thanked her. But her friendly demeanor seemed odd when she turned to Lily and said,
Women need to be careful these days. You never know when you'll walk into a trap.
The woman drove slowly along the dark highway. After a while, they stopped at a deserted gas station parking lot. Lily watched the woman step out and shut the car door behind her. Lily wanted to call her parents to let them know, but she remembered her phone was dead. Just then, a ringtone sounded, and her eyes fell on a phone lying casually on the dashboard. She thought the woman must have forgotten it. She cautiously reached out to grab it. The phone unlocked without needing a password. At that moment, a wave of dread washed over her. The phone's wallpaper flashed on the screen, showing a picture of the woman standing next to a man. He was the same man Lily had seen at the bus stop. Somehow, they were connected. Panicked, she quickly grabbed the phone and slipped out of the car, but not fast enough. The woman returned, her kind expression gone, blocking the door.
Where do you think you're going, girl?
Lily stumbled, slipping through the driver's side door to get out. As she escaped, the woman circled around the back of the car, brandishing a knife to block her path. The woman lunged at her, and instinctively, Lily raised her arm to shield herself, causing the blade to slice painfully across her skin. Lily turned to run, but the woman grabbed her hair and yanked her back. Lily screamed, twisting and clawing at her hand. Blood dripped down her arm, her strength fading from the injury. But then, a surge of survival instinct kicked in. Lily stomped and kicked at the woman's shin, making her stumble and giving Lily a brief chance to escape. As Lily sprinted toward the road, headlights appeared in the distance. It was a truck. Desperate, she waved frantically, hoping they would stop. The truck slowed down as they saw her. The woman stood just behind her and yelled,
She's stealing from me. Stop her.
A man stepped out. Lily could only cry out.
She's lying. She tried to kidnap me.
He hesitated, but the sight of Lily's bleeding arm seemed to convince him. She quickly got into his truck, and they headed to the police station. Luckily, she had evidence, her phone. It was a treasure trove of proof. They were kidnappers preying on women and children. They had a twisted scheme. The man would harass women, and the woman would pretend to be a savior. Once inside the car, the victim had no escape. Luckily, Lily avoided becoming their next victim. Months later, she still thought about that night. Since then, Lily had bought a car and vowed never to take public transportation alone at night again. The nightmare trip on Christmas Day. In December, my girlfriend Charlotte and I were driving to the Poco Mountains. We had rented a small wooden cabin that looked super cozy, decorated with Christmas ornaments, and had a beautiful view. That night, there was a snowstorm forecast, so we left a bit earlier to have time to buy groceries. After that, we headed straight to the cabin. The house was surrounded by forest, and we had to make several trips from the car to bring everything inside. I did the usual things, like checking the fridge, turning on the TV to see if there was cable or Netflix, and looking out all the windows to make sure everything was fine. Then there was a basement for recreation. I went down to check it out. It was quite large compared to the size of the house. It felt detached from the cabin, dark, and rather chilly. Then there was a knock on the front door. I hurried upstairs to answer it. I was surprised and confused to see a guy who looked like he was in his late 40s. He wore gray sweatpants and a tattered tan jacket. He smiled at me and asked,
How's everyone doing?
I started asking if he was the owner. He introduced himself as Tom and said he ran the place with his brother. Tom said he lived just up the road if my girlfriend and I needed anything. At that moment, I found it a bit odd that he knew I was with my girlfriend. He left quickly. We continued watching a Christmas movie and enjoying the quiet, but an uneasy feeling started to creep in. When I went to shower, I was startled as the water suddenly turned ice cold. I quickly got out and texted Mike, the cabin owner, asking if there was an issue with the water heater. Mike replied a while later, saying he'd send someone to check it the next day. Around midnight, we woke up to loud banging on the front door. Charlotte shook me awake, terrified. I said I'd check to see who it was, but she was terrified, begging me to stay in the room and keep quiet. The knocking continued, growing louder and more persistent, before suddenly stopping. We sat upright in silence for a few minutes, whispering to each other. I went to lock the bedroom door to feel safer. After a while of staying alert, we eventually fell asleep. The next morning, there was a lot of snow outside, and it was a cloudy, gloomy day. I stepped out to clear the snow off my car. While doing so, I noticed fresh footprints in the snow. They circled around the house. I heard footsteps approaching, and I saw Tom suddenly appear. He said,
Is everything okay?
I started telling him about what we had experienced the previous day. He even laughed at me, saying I was being paranoid, and assured me he would help check the water heater, which we had complained about earlier. Tom offered to check the water heater. Reluctantly, I agreed to follow him to the basement. At that moment, I texted Mike that Tom was here and helping me check the water heater, but Mike hadn't replied yet. Once in the basement, Tom said he needed to grab some tools from the house next door. But then, he slammed the door shut, startling me, and I had no idea what was happening. Then I heard the click of a lock, indicating the door had been locked. Before I could react, my phone buzzed with a message from Mike. He texted, "Is Tom the plumber's name?" I replied, "No, he said he's your brother." Mike then replied, "No, who is this person?" Frozen with fear, I sent a voice message. "Help me. He's here, I'm trapped, and my girlfriend is in danger." Just then, Charlotte's scream rang out. I panicked, banging on the door. A moment later, the door finally opened. In a panic, I ran upstairs and saw Tom restraining Charlotte, covering her mouth. She saw me, and while he was distracted, hit his hand. In pain, he pushed her away. At that moment, I felt a surge of strength to protect my girlfriend. I charged at him and punched him in the face, causing him to collapse temporarily. During that moment, we managed to escape the house with great difficulty, running through the snow to reach our car and driving away immediately. When I called Mike for help, he immediately contacted the police. Mike apologized for the unfortunate events and called to report the man named Tom, who had impersonated his brother. The story behind Tom's behavior involved a psychological trauma from his past. His partner had abandoned him for an extended period. He began impersonating the homeowner's brother to easily infiltrate couples' lives, creating a sense of familiarity, then stalking and observing them when they weren't paying attention, ultimately plotting to harm and separate them. Charlotte and I finally understood the reason behind Tom's behavior, and although we escaped the danger, we could never forget the terrifying hours we endured. Mystery buried under the snow. Rian had never truly clicked with Tyler, but they were still friends. Their relationship had always been complicated, marked by their differences in personality. Tyler was a complex, reserved guy with hidden corners of his life he never let anyone see. On the other hand, his mother, Diane, was the opposite, controlling, invasive, and suffocating. She seemed like a constant weight on his shoulders, though Tyler never outright said so. Their mother-son relationship might seem normal at first, but something about it never truly felt right. Diane constantly monitored Tyler with endless calls, texts, and surprise visits. He was never truly at ease during outings with friends, always explaining that he couldn't stay long because his mother would worry. When Tyler finally moved out, Rian thought things would change for him. Diane paid his rent, of course, so she couldn't entirely let go, but Tyler initially seemed more at ease. But that didn't last. He started avoiding people, skipping gatherings, and dodging calls. Rian thought Tyler was just adjusting to his new life, but one day, Rian ran into him. Tyler, looking exhausted, waved him over and asked for help fixing a leaking faucet. When Rian entered Tyler's apartment, everything seemed normal at first. However, there was an unsettling heaviness in the air. He noticed the backyard through the kitchen window was unusually dark. At first, Rian thought it was someone in the yard, but upon closer inspection, he realized it was a massive snowman. Rian frowned, jokingly pointing at it.
Who makes a snowman that big?
Tyler didn't reply, merely gesturing for him to focus on the faucet. Rian stepped into the kitchen, scanning the area for the faucet. As he approached the sink, something caught his attention. Tiny blood-red spots on the floor near the sink, scattered unevenly. At first, he thought Tyler had cut himself while cooking or something similar. That's not unusual for someone as clumsy as him. At first, they weren't clear, but upon closer inspection, something seemed off. The stains weren't random. They seemed to form a trail leading out to the yard. His brows furrowed in confusion, but he didn't react immediately. Tyler stood nearby, distant, as if lost in thought, staring blankly at the TV. As Rian knelt down to continue inspecting the faucet, something faintly glinted under the sink, catching his attention. It was a shiny keychain, stained with dried blood. Rian's hand trembled slightly as he picked it up, immediately recognizing it. It belonged to Diane, Tyler's mother, the one she always carried with her. Panic set in as he realized something was wrong. At that moment, Rian turned and saw Tyler, even though he'd heard him in the living room just seconds earlier, seemingly watching TV. His expression was blank, and he seemed unfocused.
Why is there blood on this? What's going on?
Tyler stayed silent, his gaze distant, as if calculating something. Before Rian could react, Tyler reached across the table and grabbed a kitchen knife. His movements were slow but deliberate.
You're not allowed to leave.
Tyler lunged at Rian with the knife. Instinctively, Rian stepped back but tripped over a chair, falling to the floor. Tyler raised the knife again, stepping forward with clumsy but determined strides. Rian raised his hands to defend himself, bracing for the worst. Tyler aimed for Rian's chest. Rian twisted on the ground, narrowly avoiding the blade. Tyler staggered, and that's when Rian noticed it. The keychain was still in his hand.
Wait, Tyler, calm down.
Rian shouted, but Tyler lunged again. In a desperate move, Rian stabbed Tyler's leg with the blood-stained keychain. Tyler screamed in pain, stumbling back as he looked down at his leg. Rian seized the opportunity to get up and run toward the back door. He stumbled into the giant snowman. The impact caused it to collapse, revealing a horrifying sight beneath, a pale, trembling hand. And then the fingers twitched. It was Diane.
Help.
She whispered weakly. She clung to his coat, her eyes filled with tears.
I wanted him to be happy.
Rian dragged Diane toward the patio, his arms trembling with the effort. Rian turned to see Tyler, now staggering and disoriented, looking toward them. His knees buckled, and he collapsed into the snow, sobbing uncontrollably.
I just wanted to fix everything.
The sound of sirens tore through the night as the police arrived. Tyler didn't resist as they surrounded him. He just sat there, his head in his hands, mumbling incoherently. The investigation revealed Tyler's mental breakdown. In a twisted effort to conceal his mother, he had hidden Diane inside the snowman. Tyler was sentenced to life in a mental institution, his mind damaged beyond repair. The snowman was something Rian could never forget, the desperation of Tyler and the suffering of Diane. In the freezing cold of winter, he could never look at a snowman the same way again. The echo of the forgotten sonata. Silver Hollow was known for its quiet streets, friendly faces, and a sense of safety. But the highway just outside its borders told a different story. For months, drivers had vanished without a trace, and rumors of a masked figure haunting the lonely stretch of road began to spread. Locals whispered about this mysterious stalker, but no one had seen him close enough to describe. Nick Hollis, an investigator, was assigned to go undercover as a long-haul truck driver to uncover the truth behind these mysterious disappearances. Nick was skeptical. A wholesome-looking town like Silver Hollow didn't seem like the hiding place of a serial killer. He didn't know if the road and the small town were connected, but highways didn't lie, and the rising number of disappearances demanded answers. Although he lived in the town, he had never noticed anything strange about it. Most people were genuinely kind. His cover was simple, a new truck driver passing through the area, taking odd routes to make a living. He disguised himself and rented a small apartment on the edge of town. During the day, Nick observed the locals, casually chatting at diners or gas stations. Everyone was polite, almost overly friendly, as if trying to erase any doubt. But unease settled in at night as the highway stretched endlessly into darkness, lit only by the occasional flicker of headlights. It was Nick's third night on the highway. Suddenly, a figure darted across the road, briefly illuminated by the truck's headlights. He slammed the brakes, the truck skidding slightly before coming to a halt. His mind raced. Who would be out here at this hour? He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out, scanning the roadside. As the flashlight swept across the ground, Nick spotted something wedged under a nearby rock, a crumpled piece of paper. He hesitated, then stepped forward and bent down to pick it up. The paper read, "Turn back. You won't find them alive." A chill ran down his spine. He swept the flashlight across the area again, but saw no one. Nick hurried back to his truck. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, but all he saw was the dark highway stretching behind him. The note felt like a warning, and Nick knew he couldn't ignore it. The following night, Nick parked his truck at a small rest stop along the highway to get a better vantage point. Around 2 a.m., he noticed a car with its lights off creeping along the road, as if trying to avoid detection. Nick started his truck and followed from a distance. The car turned onto a dense, overgrown path leading away from the highway. Nick parked nearby, grabbed his binoculars, and observed. A masked man stepped out of the car, dragging a heavy-looking bag. He disappeared into the trees. Nick's instincts kicked in, and he quietly followed on foot, keeping his distance. After a few minutes, he spotted the man crouched by a small fire, rummaging through the bag's contents, wallets, phones, and jewelry. Nick crept closer, careful not to make a sound. His plan was to observe long enough to identify the man and his habits, then report back. But as he moved, a twig snapped under his foot. The masked man said,
Who's there?
Nick raised his hands in surrender.
Just a truck driver passing through. Got lost.
The masked man stood up, holding a knife.
This road isn't for wandering. You should leave.
He muttered before vanishing into the woods. Nick immediately called for backup, and a quick search of the area uncovered a stash of stolen goods. 2 days later, the masked man was caught and identified as a petty thief who had been robbing and extorting travelers. Nick's instincts told him this man wasn't responsible for the disappearances. The thief's petty crimes were nothing compared to the horrors the missing travelers had faced. After capturing the masked thief on the highway, Nick couldn't shake the unease in his mind. The petty thief's words echoed in his memory. The real monster isn't dumb enough to get caught. He started noticing inconsistencies. A house with windows perpetually shut. A place he often passed but never saw anyone. Upon investigation, he realized it was his cousin Derek's house, who lived on the town's outskirts. Derek had always been approachable, someone Nick trusted. But during a casual visit to Derek's house, Nick sensed something was off. Derek's home was cozy, adorned with old family photos, and faintly smelled of wood. While chatting over coffee, Nick's sharp detective instincts picked up on strange details. Scratches on the floor near a cabinet, an unusual lock on the basement door, and a faint metallic scent in the air. While Derek excused himself to take a call, Nick wandered through the living room, his curiosity growing. A framed photo on the mantel caught his attention. It was a picture of Derek standing with a group of locals, including a man reported missing months ago. That night, Nick pretended to leave but parked his truck nearby, watching. Using his lock-picking skills, Nick snuck around the back and gently opened the door. Nick opened the basement door and descended the stairs. The stench hit him first, a nauseating mix of damp earth and decay. The dim light from a single bulb revealed a chilling scene. Rows of Polaroids were pinned to the walls, some showing missing persons from case files, all in varying states of fear and distress. A bloodied tarp covered something large on the floor. Nearby were necklaces, wallets, and torn jackets scattered carelessly. The basement resembled something out of a nightmare. Rows of industrial freezers lined the walls, each labeled with dates and names. A workbench was filled with surgical tools, knives meticulously arranged. As Nick turned to leave, he heard footsteps above. Derek's voice rang out, calm but chilling.
You weren't supposed to see this, Nick.
Derek appeared at the top of the stairs, holding a shotgun, his face devoid of its usual warmth. He revealed his twisted reasoning, claiming he was protecting the town by ensuring no locals came to harm. Knowing he couldn't reach his concealed weapon, Nick noticed a toolbox on a nearby shelf. Inside, he spotted a flashlight with a cracked lens and a reflective object sticking out of the corner, an old mirror. He began forming a plan. Nick stepped back toward the toolbox, feigning nervous compliance.
At least let me clean up the mess I've made, Derek. Let me pull the tarp back.
As Nick knelt to adjust the tarp, he discreetly grabbed the mirror from the toolbox. Using the flashlight's cracked lens to create a distraction, he angled the mirror to reflect the light from the overhead bulb. Nick raised the flashlight, aiming it at Derek. The cracked lens split the beam, momentarily blinding and distracting him with a sudden burst of light. As Derek instinctively stepped back, Nick lunged toward a nearby shelf, knocking over a stack of paint cans. The heavy cans tumbled down, causing Derek to stagger and drop the shotgun. Nick slammed the basement door shut and locked it from the outside, using a nearby chair to block the handle. Wasting no time, he pulled out his phone and called for backup. Authorities arrested Derek and seized the horrifying evidence from the basement. Inside the freezers were packages labeled as meat, but peeling back the layers revealed severed hands and feet, meticulously wrapped and disturbingly labeled. Even as the case was closed, Nick couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness of Silver Hollow ran deeper than his cousin's monstrous deeds. The impersonator of the babysitter. Dylan was home alone, sitting on the couch in the living room, when his mom walked in with Joshua, a thin man who looked nervous. He was 12 years old and believed he was old enough to stay home alone, but his parents insisted on hiring a babysitter. Dylan immediately disliked Joshua, calling him a clumsy loser, a nerd in his head. Joshua tried to be friendly, but his anxiety was clear. His mom handed over the rules for the evening. Joshua had to make sure Dylan ate, didn't stay up too late, and didn't watch horror movies. But Dylan was determined to make everything difficult. He rolled his eyes and agreed reluctantly. Once they left, Dylan turned on a horror movie with gory scenes, deliberately trying to make Joshua uncomfortable. He enjoyed watching Joshua jump at every scare, his face growing paler with each moment. Dylan started suggesting Joshua order a pizza. He almost ran into the kitchen to get away from the TV screen, and Dylan couldn't stop laughing. While he was on the phone ordering, a new, wicked idea popped into Dylan's head. After a while, they got their pizza. But as Dylan observed, something was off in Joshua's behavior. He seemed too anxious, constantly looking over his shoulder and jumping at the slightest noise. Dylan found this strange but shrugged it off, still focused on achieving his goal. Bored and wanting to scare the babysitter, Dylan suggested they play hide and seek in the dark. He thought Joshua would be desperate to escape the horror movie and agreed without hesitation. Things started to get strange. While in the bathroom, Dylan heard the doorbell ring, but he was a little surprised since the pizza was delivered so early. But when he stepped out, he saw Joshua staring at the front door with a scared expression, saying no one was there, and he thought it was the pizza delivery guy. The game started. and Joshua went to hide. Dylan found him after 5 minutes. Dylan asked,
Why didn't you try hiding in the basement?
Joshua said,
The dark scares me.
in Dylan's mind, the perfect plan continued to form. Joshua began pressing his face into the wall and counting, while Dylan hid, thoroughly enjoying his plan. The boy hid in the kitchen, secretly holding the TV remote, waiting for the perfect moment. As he started searching and approached the TV, the boy suddenly turned the volume all the way up, the sound of a terrifying scene, nearly giving him a heart attack. That was when the boy thought about hiding in his parents' closet to jump out and scare him. Dylan quietly tiptoed towards the bedroom, opened the closet, and that's when everything went still. Inside the closet was a dead body. It was a man with his head wrapped in a plastic bag, seemingly suffocated. Dylan, in a panic, tried to understand the situation, and suddenly I noticed a wallet sticking out of the man's pocket. The boy reached for it. He found an ID card that read Joshua Miller. If his babysitter, Joshua Miller, was dead in the closet, then the boy had no idea who he was playing hide and seek with. There was a killer in his house. He quickly ran under the bed, trying to steady his breath so the man wouldn't hear him breathing. A pair of feet entered and stopped right in front of the open closet.
Congratulations. It seems like you found your babysitter.
He said. Dylan realized that the game he had set up just minutes ago had now turned into a survival mission, as his life depended on it. The man pretending to be Joshua revealed himself to be Kyle. He had planned to trap Joshua for killing the boy, and now he intended to kill Dylan as well. His face suddenly dipped under the bed, and he screamed.
It's your turn to be like Joshua.
Dylan, in a final desperate moment, ran out from under the bed. Kyle chased him, lunging at him with a knife. The blade ripped his shirt, but luckily it missed.
I thought you liked horror movies.
He mocked the boy.
This is your real-life horror movie, kid.
Dylan fearfully ran into a room and locked the door. Then he heard the doorbell. Through the window, he saw it was the pizza delivery person. Dylan shouted for help.
Call 911 right now.
But before the pizza guy could assess the situation, Joshua ran downstairs, opened the door, and charged at him with a knife. The pizza guy was stronger. After a struggle, he managed to pin Kyle down and snatched the knife from his hand. Kyle was convicted of murder. Dylan's parents rushed home after being contacted by the police. They were also grateful and gave the pizza guy a sum of money to thank him for saving the boy. Dylan's parents never left him alone with anyone again. Whenever they had to go out, he stayed with his grandmother. They would never hire a babysitter again. The horror Dylan experienced that night would stay with him forever. The price of the silent one. I glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. I thought it was time to head home. I left the lab late one evening after a long day of experiments. The night was dark, the streets deserted, and the cold air biting at anyone daring to venture out. The road was empty, and the only sound was the distant howl of the wind. As I drove, I suddenly noticed something moving by the roadside. A figure, a girl, walking alone in the desolation. She seemed disoriented, wearing a red coat, her head bowed, and her posture rigid, standing out under the dim light. Something about her felt off, so I slowed my car and came to a stop. I asked her if she was okay. "Do you need a ride?" The girl didn't reply. She kept walking, her steps slow, as if she didn't even notice my presence. Finally, the girl stopped, and she slowly turned around. She had a beautiful face, but her skin was deathly pale, with an expression of anguish, as if she had forgotten how to smile forever. She asked for a ride and said she was on her way home. I politely hesitated at first, but then I agreed to give her a ride. I drove along the dark road as the girl sat silently in the back, staring out of the window. As I drove through the town, approaching an old cemetery, the girl's behavior suddenly shifted. She began to grow increasingly agitated. Suddenly, she started clawing at the car window with her nails, screaming hysterically as if she were desperate to escape. She shouted, "Let me out! Let me out!" Panicked and unsure what was happening, I scrambled to unlock the door. She flung the car door open and bolted towards the cemetery. Her speed was unnatural, almost too fast, disappearing into the night. I got out of the car, calling after her, but she was gone, leaving me standing alone in the eerie silence of the darkness. Confused, I drove away, chalking the incident up as nothing more than a strange encounter. A few nights later, I drove home along the same route, but every night, something strange and puzzling happened. I encountered her again, asking for a ride. Each time as we neared the cemetery, she would scream, louder than before, and run into the darkness. It was like a looped tape, ending in terror every single time. My curiosity grew, and I began to wonder if I was witnessing something from another world. After 4 consecutive nights of experiencing the same bizarre encounter, I couldn't ignore her strange, repetitive behavior anymore. I was haunted by thoughts of what might be happening at the cemetery, and the image of her running remained etched in my mind. The next day, I decided to visit the cemetery to investigate. I began noticing the old, weathered gravestones, a strange sensation settling over me as I surveyed the area. After some searching, I stumbled upon a gravestone bearing the name Lydia Ward. What shocked me even more was the image on the grave. It was the girl who had asked for a ride. I was frozen in disbelief. Her date of death was engraved as 7 years ago. A chill ran down my spine as I read the words "killed" in a ritual. My mind began to spiral as the name and face felt eerily familiar. I couldn't shake the memory of another girl named Lydia. She had been killed in a satanic ritual. I realized that I might have been the one who witnessed her death all those years ago. When I was a student, I had taken part in a challenge to prove that demons weren't real and thought I was the only one at the cemetery. But suddenly, I was startled by the sound of a girl screaming. I followed the sound and discovered 3 men torturing a girl. I hid behind a bush to avoid being seen and watched as the men carried out what appeared to be some kind of satanic ritual. When the ritual ended, I thought it was over, or perhaps just a bizarre performance. Then, I saw the men sacrifice the girl, one of them holding a knife, attempting to take her life. I couldn't think of anything. I was terrified and quietly ran away. I acted like a coward, staying silent to avoid getting myself into trouble. My thoughts are now clouded by guilt and confusion. I was one of the last people to see Lydia alive. I feel responsible for not doing more, for not intervening when I saw her that day. I spent the next few days researching Lydia's death. I dug through old police records, spoke to former classmates, and visited the university archives. I discovered that Lydia's death was a tragic and mysterious event. Some students at the school had joined a cult-like group that conducted rituals in the cemetery, and Lydia was their victim. Although the police investigated, no one was convicted. My guilt grew as I realized that I had been there that day but was too afraid to intervene. Perhaps that's why her spirit has come to me. As I dug deeper into everything, I began experiencing strange occurrences. I constantly heard whispers in my home, and at night, Lydia appeared every night, standing at the foot of my bed with her sunken, sorrowful eyes, her mouth whispering softly. My room always felt cold, the air thick and heavy, as if her grief was pressing down on me. I began to wonder if Lydia's spirit was trying to tell me something. Perhaps her murder was tied to a larger conspiracy, and only I could uncover the truth. I returned to the cemetery. I felt her presence guiding me, leading me to a hidden spot behind an old mausoleum. I discovered numerous symbols, etched onto the old stone walls and trees surrounding the cemetery. They resembled symbols used in ancient satanic rituals. My hands trembled as I took photos. The cult had used this place. Lydia had died here, sacrificed to summon whatever they worshipped. Piecing together everything I knew, I realized that Lydia's death was only part of a larger ritual that was taking place. The cult had used the lives of innocent people to summon dark forces, and Lydia was the final sacrifice. Overwhelmed by the truth, I knew I couldn't let this mystery remain hidden and unanswered any longer. I finally gathered enough evidence, photos, documents, symbols, to bring to the police and share what I had hidden and discovered. I knew that my actions were the only way to free her soul. The police finally launched a comprehensive investigation into the cult's activities, arresting several former students and members who had participated in the rituals. In the end, justice was served for Lydia, and her soul could finally rest after 7 years of torment. In the final moments, I visited Lydia's grave once more. This time, as I stood before her grave, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. By uncovering the truth, I had redeemed myself, and now I could let go of the guilt that had haunted me for so long. As Rick turned to leave, he glanced back and saw a figure standing in the distance, Lydia's red coat billowing in the wind. He smiled softly, knowing she was no longer trapped, but finally free. The mystery behind a portrait. Moving in with Eric was supposed to be the start of something beautiful, but the moment she crossed the threshold, an unsettling chill enveloped her. Jamie's gaze settled on a large painting prominently displayed in the living room. It was a portrait of a beautiful woman with long, dark hair and piercing eyes. From the moment she saw it, she felt deeply uneasy. The woman's eyes seemed strangely alive. Jamie shivered, feeling the weight of those eyes on her. She thought it was watching her. She glanced at Eric, who was arranging painting supplies nearby.
It's just a painting, Jamie.
He reassured her with a soft laugh, but something inside her didn't agree. As Jamie lay in bed, she couldn't shake the image of the woman's piercing gaze. It felt as though the woman in the painting wanted to tell her something. Then one night, she had a nightmare, the woman stepping out of the painting. A cold hand gripped her arm, and the woman in the painting whispered one chilling word.
Run.
Jamie jolted awake in panic. She could still feel her presence in the room, her eyes burning into Jamie. After another sleepless night, she asked Eric to move the painting out of their shared space, and reluctantly he agreed. He moved it to his office, but the unease remained, growing with each passing day. Instead of feeling relieved, things only got worse. He spent hours in his office with the painting, muttering to himself in soft, frantic whispers. When he appeared, his arms were scratched and bruised, as if he had fought with something or someone. Jamie's suspicion grew. One night, after Eric had fallen asleep, Jamie gathered her courage and snuck into his office, determined to uncover what was going on. As Jamie got closer to the painting on the wall, the woman's eyes now looked fiercer than ever. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to take a photo with her phone. Jamie began researching the image. Her heart sank as she found an old article. The woman in the painting was real, a young woman named Anna who had disappeared years ago. The last person seen with her alive was her boyfriend, who also vanished without a trace. She looked closer at the image of Anna. There was an eerie coincidence, her earrings. They were identical to the pair Eric had given her on their 1-month anniversary. With fear rising, Jamie's eyes darted around the room, searching for more clues. She noticed a white cloth over an easel, as if Eric was preparing to start a new painting. But what caught her attention was a knife lying next to his paintbrushes. Suddenly, Jamie felt a chill run down her spine. She turned back to the painting, and this time, Anna's expression had changed. Her mouth twisted and moved, forming the exact word Jamie had heard in her nightmare.
Run.
Jamie turned around, panic engulfing her. Eric was standing in the doorway, his face darkened with anger. He began asking her what she was doing there. Jamie backed away, but he continued advancing, gripping the knife tightly and saying that she knew too much. As he raised the knife, Jamie bolted, running down the hallway as fast as she could. She ran toward the door, fumbling with her phone to dial 911. But Eric was faster. He grabbed her by the neck just as she reached the front door, pulling her back with terrifying strength. Just when she thought it was all over, she heard sirens blaring outside. The police burst in. They quickly subdued Eric, pinning him to the ground as he thrashed and screamed in rage. While searching the house, the police found ample evidence behind a hidden door in Eric's basement. Behind it was a small, dusty room filled with Anna's belongings. But the most chilling discovery was Anna's decaying body hidden in Eric's basement. Finally, her spirit was set free. Before leaving, Jamie returned to Eric's office one last time. Anna's painting still hung on the wall. Her eyes were gentle, her face no longer twisted in fear or sorrow. Instead, she looked at Jamie with gratitude. The secret of the black umbrella. Last June, I had just moved to the city to attend college. Heavy rain soaked the campus as I trudged toward the dormitory, my luggage drenched. I walked through the courtyard, and my eyes caught sight of a black umbrella lying on the ground. At that moment, I wanted to find its owner, but I couldn't see anyone around. Reluctantly, I picked it up, thinking I would try to find its owner later. So, I decided to take the umbrella to the dormitory. But when I got to the dorm, I had to rush to change out of my wet clothes and prepare for bed. In the meantime, I hung the umbrella up and almost completely forgot about its existence. Outside, the rain continued to fall. After a long day and soon feeling exhausted, I prepared to sleep. As I lay down, the thought of the umbrella crossed my mind, but I brushed it aside. I woke up at midnight, feeling cold despite being under a thick blanket. A strange chill seemed to seep through the room, and as I lay there, I noticed a shadow in the hallway outside my door. But when I got up to check, I found the hallway empty. This left me a little perplexed. Then, I looked at the black umbrella hanging by the door again and told myself that I would return it in the morning. The next morning, my roommate found me feverish, my skin damp and my body weak. The dorm manager allowed me to stay in bed and rest while my friends went to class. I lay there, dozing off intermittently, the sound of rain pattering against the window only adding to my fatigue. As I slept, I heard footsteps echoing in my room, slow and cautious, as if someone was approaching. My eyes opened wide, but I was too weak to move. I felt a figure hovering beside me, suspended by the bed. Gathering all my strength, I turned my head, and my breath caught in my throat. Standing next to me was a young man, drenched in wet clothes, water dripping onto the floor. I couldn't understand how he got in. I hadn't heard the door open. Then what was peculiar was that in his hand, he held tightly onto the handle of the black umbrella. But the scariest thing was the bloodied, pale, gaunt face, the sunken, distorted eyes of the young man glaring at me with anger. I sat up in fear. He stepped closer, lowering the umbrella and raising his hand, reaching towards me as if to corner me against the wall. I stepped back as the young man leaned closer, his voice hoarse with anger as he demanded the black umbrella back. He made me feel terrified, and I screamed. As he pushed me against the wall, his rage overwhelming, I felt myself slipping away, dizzy with fear. I accidentally hit my head against the wall behind me. The last thing I remembered was his hateful gaze. When I opened my eyes, I saw the dorm manager standing next to my bed, worry etched on her face. She asked if I was okay, saying she heard me scream. I struggled to explain what I had seen, my words tumbling out in a jumble. I was confused about how to answer her. Then she and I looked down at the floor. At that moment, I was startled to see that the black umbrella I had hung at the door was no longer there. Instead, it lay beside my bed as if it had moved on its own. A chill ran down my spine, and I told the manager about the figure I had seen, the young man holding the umbrella. The owner of this umbrella had come here to reclaim it. She didn't say anything after listening, only silently picked up the umbrella. Her demeanor surprised me. It seemed she knew something. She began to tell me the story about that umbrella. Years ago, there was a student living in my dorm, a hard-working young man from a difficult background. He worked multiple jobs to pay for his education, and despite his struggles, he was well liked by everyone. The young man's father, an unusual man with a gambling addiction, tracked him down. After stealing all the money the young man had saved for his tuition, he vanished without a word. Heartbroken and crushed, the young man's spirit became bleak. Until one day, the entire dorm suddenly erupted in chaos after a loud noise rang out from the balcony. Teachers and friends were shocked to discover that he had thrown himself from the balcony. The young man's body lay motionless in a pool of blood, and no one dared to approach to help. The manager said she was there that night. Compassionately, she stood in the rain, holding the umbrella over him until his body was taken away in an ambulance. After the incident, due to the chaos, her umbrella was lost somewhere untraceable and gradually faded into obscurity. A strong gust of wind shook the door, and both of us jumped and looked up. In the doorway, I saw a figure, a young man, soaked and pale, standing just outside. The manager seemed to recognize him immediately. Suppressing her fear, she stepped closer to the apparition, her voice trembling as she spoke soothing words about his pain and loss. Any resentment within the young man seemed to dissipate. After that, everything ended, and I no longer saw that student. My manager continued to oversee my dorm. The black umbrella remained, hanging beside her in the office as a memento of the deceased student. Strange Grinch toy. Ethan had always been fascinated by the Grinch. His house was filled with Grinch memorabilia, from posters to collectibles. He viewed the Grinch as a misunderstood genius, and his collection was a tribute to this eccentric character. One day, while wandering through a flea market, Ethan stumbled upon an old, dusty Grinch toy. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its fur was matted and patchy, its grin unnaturally wide, and its eyes impossibly deep. When Ethan picked it up, it was warm. Not warm as if it had been sitting in the sun, but warm as if it were alive. His chest tightened, and he reassured himself it was just excitement. Ethan asked the seller for the price, but the man didn't even look at him. He muttered, "Take it, it's free," and told him to leave. Ethan placed the toy on the shelf in the center of his Grinch collection. As he stared at it, a creeping sensation ran down his spine, as if it were staring back. That's when things started to go wrong. The presence of the toy made him uneasy, and Ethan began hearing whispers in his house. As the days went by, every time he passed a mirror, his reflection became distorted. Sometimes his face would morph into a grotesque Grinch-like grin. Before it returned to normal, the decorations around his house seemed different. The Grinch figurines on his shelf appeared to change. When Ethan wasn't paying attention, their grins thinned, their eyes deepened. The whispers grew louder, and everything felt stranger. And then the dreams began to haunt him. In his dreams, Ethan saw him every night, tormented by a taller version of the Grinch. It had patchy green fur, a jagged, wide grin, and eyes glowing with malice. The Grinch watched Ethan from the foot of his bed, whispering things Ethan couldn't understand, but one phrase stuck with him.
Come with me.
Ethan woke up drenched in sweat, his heart racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. His obsession with the Grinch now seemed to control him. That's when Ethan began digging. He needed answers and spent days researching, scouring obscure forums and books dedicated to Christmas folklore. Then Ethan stumbled upon an old legend, a cursed Grinch toy mentioned in a book. According to folklore, the toy was not just a collectible but a trap. It fed on its owner's obsession, gradually transforming them into the very thing they admired most. Something inside Ethan didn't want to believe it, but he tried to get rid of the toy and threw it in the trash. That night, Ethan saw images of the Grinch everywhere, even hearing its voice in his head. The whispers were no longer vague but became clearer.
Let me in.
Or,
You are part of me now.
but the next morning, it was back on the shelf. Ethan tried burning it, but the toy reappeared, its grin even wider. Each failed attempt to destroy it only deepened his fear and obsession. Ethan lost his mind on Christmas Eve. That was the last time he truly saw himself. This time, however, it wasn't Ethan in the mirror, it was the Grinch. Then it morphed back into his face, but it was stitched at the edges. His body trembled as he began to feel something changing inside him. Ethan screamed and punched the mirror. That was when he realized he was no longer just seeing the Grinch. He was becoming the Grinch. In a moment of madness, Ethan stood in the bathroom, staring into the mirror with a knife in his hand, blood dripping from his cheek. Now, Ethan's face bled from the wound as he carved the grin deeper. His obsession had pushed him beyond the limits of sanity. When he woke up, he was in a psychiatric hospital, surrounded by doctors and nurses who deemed him dangerous. He had harmed himself. They couldn't comprehend the curse that had consumed him. His neighbors had brought him there due to his madness. They mocked him, calling him Grinch, not realizing that what Ethan saw was real. Every night, Ethan would still see it, the Grinch, standing in the dark corner of his room, flashing a sinister grin. Highway Trap Maker. It had been a long day of driving for me. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was nearly 9 p.m. I stopped at a small gas station, dimly lit, filled up the tank, and bought an energy drink from the store. The cool night air brushed against my face as I stretched before climbing back into the truck. With a 3-hour drive ahead, I settled into the seat, ready for the journey. The open road stretched out before me, desolate, bathed in the soft glow of the headlights. My only companion was the music playing through the cabin. I drifted a bit, feeling slightly drowsy, and quickly focused back on the road, allowing my mind to wander as I sipped my drink, hoping it would help keep me awake. Around 11 p.m., a sudden crackle pulled me from my drowsiness. The sound came from the radio I had on the trucker channel. With everything so quiet, the noise startled me. Through the static, I thought I heard a voice, faint and unclear. The words were difficult to make out, but it sounded like hello or help. My heart raced a little faster as I glanced around, looking into the darkness behind the headlights, but there were no other vehicles in sight. I grabbed the radio and pressed the button, my voice trembling as I asked, "Is anyone out there? Do you need help?" I waited, listening to the static fill the silence, but there was no response. Just as I was about to release the button, my headlights caught something ahead on the road. I slowed the truck down, coming to a stop as I saw a large rig parked in the middle of the road, motionless. It was strange. There were no signs of anyone around, no lights, nothing at all. I pulled over to the side and climbed out, the chill of the night air making me shiver. As I approached the rig, I called out, my voice breaking the strange silence. Hello? Is anyone there? But my voice was swallowed by the emptiness around me. I climbed into the open door of the truck and looked inside. My heart sank as I realized it was empty. There was no one inside. The driver's seat vacant, but a jacket hung over the passenger seat, a half-finished cup of coffee in the holder. The radio was silent now, but a faint static still lingered in the air. It was as if the driver had simply vanished. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no clues as to where they had gone. A shiver ran down my spine, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave this place, a growing sense of unease gnawing at me. I stepped away from the rig, scanning my surroundings, my eyes sweeping over the dark fields on either side of the road. The tall grass swayed, casting eerie shadows that shifted under the moonlight. Then something peculiar caught my eye, a faded photo pinned to the dashboard. I squinted in the dim light, leaning in for a closer look. It was a family photo, the kind you might get at a cheap roadside stand. A man stood with his wife and daughter, smiling, carefree. I didn't recognize the man, but there was something in his expression that filled me with a sense of sadness. I stepped back, my gaze lingering on the photo as a chill ran down my spine. That's when I realized this truck wasn't just abandoned. Perhaps it was a trap, deliberately left here to lure someone, anyone, into this desolate stretch of road. A twig snapped behind me, the sudden noise cutting through the night like a knife. My instincts kicked in, and I whipped around just in time to see a figure emerging from the darkness, their face obscured. My heart raced as I took a step back, my mind scrambling for a plan. I was alone, isolated, surrounded only by trees and an empty highway. I couldn't run. He would catch me in seconds. Thinking quickly, I scrambled back into the empty truck, my hands shaking as I rummaged through the cabin. I found a wrench on the floor and gripped it tightly, crouching down inside the truck, preparing myself as I listened for approaching footsteps. The figure approached the open door, his face finally illuminated by the moonlight. He was grinning widely, a cold, threatening smile that made me shudder, and I realized with horrifying clarity that he had done this before. He stepped closer, moving slowly and deliberately, savoring the fear in my eyes. But I wouldn't go down without a fight. I charged at him, swinging the wrench with all my might, catching him off guard. We stumbled out of the truck, struggling on the ground. The night came alive with the sounds of our scuffle, grunts and the scrape of shoes on gravel. He was stronger than I was, but desperation fueled me, making me fight harder, faster. I tried to break free, staggering to my feet as he pulled back, clutching his shoulder. For a moment, we just stared at each other, both of us breathing heavily, the tension thick and suffocating. I gripped the wrench tightly, ready, but he hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty passing over his face. I seized on his hesitation, advancing with the wrench raised. He stepped back, the threat in his eyes replaced with something else, perhaps fear. He turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness, the sound of his footsteps fading until there was nothing but silence. I climbed back into my truck, locking the doors as I settled into the seat, my hands still trembling from what had just happened. I reached for the radio, my voice barely above a whisper as I called for help, my words spilling out in a rush. I told them everything: the abandoned truck, the photo, the man who attacked me. They assured me that help was on the way, that the police would be there soon. The flashing lights of the police car cut through the night, a relief after feeling like the darkness stretched on forever. I watched as the officers investigated the scene, their flashlights casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. One of the officers approached me, his expression grim as he recounted what they had found. The truck belonged to a man reported missing weeks ago. A man with a family, a wife and young daughter. They suspected foul play, but there was currently no sign of him. The man, they found footprints leading into the woods, but they ended abruptly, as if he had vanished into thin air. It was as if the darkness itself had swallowed him, leaving nothing but an unsettling silence. The sun began to rise as I sat in the truck. The police had temporarily concluded their investigation, saying they would keep me updated, that they would do everything they could to find the missing man and bring the attacker to justice. I took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I didn't know what awaited me ahead, but I knew one thing. I had survived that night and escaped the trap he had set. A few days later, I was called to the police station to discuss the investigation. A policeman sat across from me, his eyes serious as he flipped through a thick stack of papers. He explains that they have identified both the attacker and the missing man, piecing together the details of a dark plot. The attacker, a vagrant with a violent history, was responsible for a series of disappearances along this stretch of highway. He preyed on both truckers and tourists, luring them in with abandoned cars, like the one I found, using them as bait to satisfy his twisted sense of control. The man in the photo is one of his victims. But this time, the attacker did not escape. After he ran away from me that night, he made a mistake, leaving behind clues that led the police to him. They find him hiding in an old, dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts of town, the walls covered with memorabilia stolen from his victims. The officer who showed me the photo from the abandoned truck, now sealed in a plastic evidence bag, told me they would notify the victim's family. I stared at the photo, feeling a mixture of relief and bitterness, knowing that this monster would no longer haunt the highway, no longer tear apart the lives of innocent people. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is ideal for anyone who enjoys solitude. It's just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when it's absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we split the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the whole school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this thousands of times, but something about this night felt different, like something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and continued cleaning, walking through each hallway. I wore my headphones, playing music softly enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a short break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I came back, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had set up earlier was knocked over. I sighed and went to pick it up, but that's when I saw them small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints down the hallway, leading to the stairs up to the second floor. The footprints stopped at the top of the stairs. I paused, trying to hear anything. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flash of movement at the end of the hall. My pulse quickened, and I hurried to the end of the hall, but no one was there. Just then, I heard faint laughter, like the giggle of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending chills down my spine. I turned around, looking for the source of the laughter, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket, which I had just filled with clean water, was tipped over, spilling water all over the floor. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was going on. Were there still students in the building, or had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was messing with her. She looked at me, completely confused, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her station, more confused than ever, and went back to work. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It was unsettling, like the entire building had turned into the set of a horror movie. I knew where the electrical room was, and since I had the keys, I decided to head there to fix the lights. But before I could get there, I heard a scream. My coworker's scream, filled with fear, echoed through the school. I ran toward the electrical room, fear rising inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my chest. When I pushed the door open, expecting to see my coworker inside, instead, there was a figure standing in the darkness. I couldn't make out who it was, but something was wrong. My blood ran cold as the figure moved closer, its movements unnatural, almost jerky. I reached for my phone, but before I could pull it out of my pocket, the figure lunged forward and slammed the door in my face. Panic overwhelmed me. I staggered back. I had to get out of there. I ran, my legs moving faster than ever. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was gone, no sign of her. I called out her name, but there was no reply. The only sound was that faint laughter again, echoing through the empty hallway. The whispering froze me in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly turned around, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I started walking again, my steps slow and cautious, my senses on high alert. This wasn't just a prank. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I went up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. As I ventured further down the second floor hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, were back. I froze, staring at the small, wet prints that seemed to be coming toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. That's when I saw the blackboard. Written in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." I hadn't seen that before. Someone had been in here, but I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The doorknob twisted hard, and the door shook as if someone or something was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The banging stopped. Silence returned, but the tension in the air remained. I slowly crept toward the door, pressing my ear against it. Nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as I could. I cracked the door open just a little and peeked out into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, looking around for any sign of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. I started walking down, and just then, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the red emergency lights. I squinted, trying to make out the shape. It was small, like a child. As I got closer, I could see more clearly a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a torn school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The boy didn't respond. I took another step, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. The boy's face was a grotesque mask, pale, soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, twisted grin. My heart nearly stopped. The child let out a piercing scream that echoed through the staircase, a sound so shrill it felt like it was tearing through my skull. I stumbled back, dropping the mop, My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to run. I sprinted down the hallway, gasping for breath. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly in a horrific way. I burst through the double doors into the gymnasium, slamming them shut behind me. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body shaking with fear. The footsteps stopped. The doors stayed closed. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard a ball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the boy stood, his face still twisted in that grotesque grin, holding a basketball and slowly bouncing it on the floor. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing in the empty space of the gymnasium. I backed away, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as if he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they could give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted grin. I floored the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't go back the next night. I never went back there again. Intruder from the garage. It was just another long, dull day at school. But as I walked home, the excitement of Friday relieved me. Tomorrow was a day off from school. Finally, I could relax. As I approached home, I noticed something strange. The garage door was wide open, and the light inside was still on. My dad had left early that day for a business trip, so he must have rushed and forgotten to close it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I went into the garage, turned off the light, and pulled the door shut behind me. The silence of the house welcomed me as I stepped inside, and the thought of having the whole place to myself felt like freedom. My mom had gone to a friend's house for the evening, so I settled in for a night of video games and movies. Hours passed as I immersed myself in my game. The house was quiet except for the occasional noise from the TV. I decided to get a drink, and as I walked into the kitchen, something caught my attention. The light in the garage was on again. I paused. A strange, eerie feeling washed over me. Had I forgotten to turn it off? Or had my mom come home? But I hadn't heard her come in. My heart began to race as I approached the garage door, my footsteps feeling heavy. As I stepped into the garage, every drawer in my dad's workshop was open. His tools were scattered across the floor as if someone had frantically searched for something, but there was no one here. I quickly turned back inside, locking the garage door. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I prepared to head back to the living room, planning to try to watch TV to calm down. Then, from behind me, I heard the garage door handle rattle violently. I froze, staring at the door, watching it shake harder, as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, my hand trembling as I realized I needed to get out of the house. In my panic, I didn't notice that the noise had suddenly stopped. The silence was chilling. It was too quiet. I ran straight for the front door. My only thought was to escape. But as I stepped into the living room, I froze in my tracks. He was there, a large man, his back turned to me. In his hand, he gripped a hatchet, likely taken from my dad's workshop. I held my breath, terrified he would turn around and see me. The TV was still playing, masking the sound of my footsteps, and I knew this was my only chance. Going back upstairs was impossible. I quietly turned around and headed for the back door, trying to remain calm. Once outside, I didn't stop running. I hurried to my neighbor's house, knocking on the door until they let me in. I waited there, heart pounding, watching my house from across the street as I prayed the intruder wouldn't come looking for me. I knocked on my neighbor's door, my heart racing, breath coming in gasps. It felt like an eternity before Mr. Thompson finally opened the door, his face etched with confusion. I recounted everything that had happened to him. His eyes widened, and without saying a word, he grabbed a flashlight and his old baseball bat. He was determined to check my house for me, assuring me that everything would be okay. I reluctantly stayed behind, watching him cross the street. My body still trembled with fear, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I had called the police. They were on their way, but the thought of that man in my house, with my dad's hatchet in hand, haunted me. I watched as Mr. Thompson cautiously approached the front door, using the flashlight to scan the windows and garage. He disappeared inside. I strained to listen for anything, but everything was eerily silent. Suddenly, I saw him step outside, and from across the street, a small voice echoed back, "There's no one there. The house is empty." A wave of relief washed over me, but I still needed to remain vigilant. As Mr. Thompson started to walk toward me, I felt that lingering anxiety return. Before I could voice my concerns, a dark figure shifted behind him. My blood ran cold. The intruder. He was there, emerging from the shadows of the house, with an axe glinting under the dim porch light. I screamed, trying to warn Mr. Thompson, but it was too late. As he turned around, the intruder lunged at him. A fierce struggle ensued. Mr. Thompson swung the baseball bat, but the intruder was strong. The two grappled, the axe dangerously close to Mr. Thompson's head as they stumbled across the lawn. My legs wouldn't move, paralyzed with fear as I watched the scene unfold. Every second felt like a nightmare. Mr. Thompson tried to deliver a solid blow with the bat, striking the man's ribs, but it wasn't enough. The intruder howled in pain, but instead of backing off, he raised the axe, ready to attack. Just as the axe came down, Mr. Thompson lunged to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike. In that moment of distraction, Mr. Thompson landed another blow, throwing the intruder off balance. I finally decided to rush forward to help, but before I could reach them, the sound of police sirens rang out. The intruder looked up at the sound of the sirens, and in a final effort to escape, he sprinted toward the backyard. Mr. Thompson staggered to his feet, breathing heavily but still standing strong. The police arrived just in time, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they chased after the man. Within minutes, they had subdued him. The man thrashed wildly, growling like a wild beast, but the police quickly overpowered him, pinning him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. I stood there, trembling, watching the whole scene unfold. Mr. Thompson walked over to me, holding his side where he had been hit, but he still managed to smile. "You're safe now." I felt grateful, as if I had been saved. I recounted every detail I could remember to the police, but all I wanted to do was forget. I sat down on Mr. Thompson's porch, my body shaking, watching the man being driven away in the police car. It was all over, but the image of the intruder's face, his wild eyes, and the sound of the axe slicing through the air would haunt me forever. Mr. Thompson sat next to me, placing his hand on my shoulder for reassurance. "You did the right thing, kid," he said softly. "It's over now." But deep down, I knew the fear would linger with me. I would never forget how close I had come to being trapped in the grip of something truly evil. Nightmare Neighbor. The old, tall apartment building stood under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was late, and most of the windows were dark. Rena stood outside the building, staring up at the second floor where her apartment was. She had lived here for a few months, and the place had always been quiet. Until Arthur moved in next door. Rena's apartment was at the end of the hallway on the second floor, and the trip to take out the trash usually took only a few minutes. But tonight, she felt eyes on her. As she was about to turn the corner at the end of the hall, there he was. Arthur was standing by his door, as if waiting for her. He always found a reason to talk and stand too close to her. She kept her head down, mumbled a quick greeting, and brushed past him toward the stairs. This time, he said nothing. A chill ran down Rena's spine. Something was different tonight, something that made her more uneasy than before. Rena stepped into her apartment and quickly shut the door. She took a moment to calm herself, telling herself she was overreacting. She turned off the lights in the living room, planning to head to bed and watch some TV. It was late, and she was tired but not quite ready to sleep. As she passed the broom closet, she heard a faint sound, like a rustling from inside. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, staring at the closet door. With trembling hands, she reached for the closet handle. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her not to open it, but she had to. She couldn't just leave it. She pulled the door open. Arthur was standing there, in her closet. For a split second, time seemed to stop. He was just standing there, staring at her, unblinking, with a twisted smile on his face. She gasped, stumbling backward. Her heart raced as panic rose inside her. He stepped forward, crawling out of the closet like a predator closing in on its prey. She ran into the bedroom, slamming the door shut, but she didn't have time to lock it. The door flew open, and Arthur was right there, his face wild. She dashed for the bathroom, her final place of refuge. She slammed the door just as Arthur reached the bedroom. Her hands fumbled with the lock. Rena pressed her back against the cold bathroom wall. Her breath came in sharp gasps as Arthur pounded on the door, trying to break through. The thin wooden door was all that separated her from the man who had been stalking her for weeks, his sick grin etched into her mind. Thankfully, she had brought her phone with her. She gripped it tightly, her fingers trembling as she spoke to the police. Her voice was barely a whisper, fear choking her words. Arthur slammed the door again, the wood splintering under the force. Rena knew it wouldn't hold much longer. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. She held her breath, pressing her ear to the door, straining to hear any sound. Was he gone? Had he given up? Arthur stood outside the bathroom door, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild with anticipation. His patience was wearing thin. His hand hovered over the doorknob before he stepped back, glancing at Rena's bedroom. He knew she was cornered, with nowhere to go. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, shiny knife. His fingers tightened around the handle, and his eyes narrowed. With a single powerful kick, the bathroom door splintered apart. The door burst open, and Arthur lunged inside, his eyes wide and feral. She backed up until she was almost against the wall. She screamed for him to stay away, but Arthur didn't stop. He lunged at her, grabbing her arm in a grip so tight it would leave bruises. Rena tried to pull away, but he was too strong. Pain shot down her spine as he twisted her wrist, pinning it to the wall. Her phone slipped from her hand, crashing to the floor. Arthur's face was now only a few centimeters from hers, whispering threats because she always ignored him in the hallway. Rena struggled, trying to break free, but he pulled her closer, tightening his grip. His knife slashed through the air, grazing her arm. She gasped as a sharp pain cut through her skin, blood trickling down. The sound of sirens tore through the night, growing louder as the police raced toward the apartment building. Flashing lights reflected off the windows, like a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. Inside, Rena's vision blurred with panic and pain. He shoved her against the wall again, laughing maniacally as he brought the knife closer to her throat. Her body screamed for escape. Her free hand groped blindly along the counter near the sink, desperately searching for anything she could use to defend herself. She grabbed a glass soap bottle and, without thinking, smashed it over Arthur's head. The glass shattered, and he staggered back, momentarily dazed. Arthur staggered. The knife slipped from his hand and fell to the floor. Rena did not wait. She rushed out the door, holding her throbbing arm that was bleeding from the cut he made. She ran out of the bathroom and into the living room, her mind screaming for escape. But Arthur wasn't far behind. Stunned, but enraged, he grabbed the knife again and charged toward her, blood streaming down his face from where the glass had struck him. The police burst through the front door of the apartment complex, racing up the stairs to the second floor. They knew they had to act quickly. Rena reached the living room, but her legs buckled beneath her, sending her crashing to the floor. She could feel Arthur's looming presence, approaching with the knife in hand. His eyes were now filled with rage, the twisted delight gone. He reached for her, grabbing her hair. Rena winced in pain, trying to get up, her body screaming for help. Arthur growled, his voice low and venomous. "There's nowhere left to run, girl." Just as he raised the knife again, the apartment door burst open with a loud crash. The police swarmed into the apartment, guns drawn. "Drop the weapon," one of them shouted, their voices slicing through the tension. Arthur hesitated, giving Rena the opening she needed. She kicked his leg hard, causing him to cry out in pain. She ran toward the police, gasping for breath, blood dripping from her arm. But the nightmare was finally over. Rena sat on the edge of the ambulance, her mind still reeling, her body in shock. She watched as the police loaded Arthur into the back of their car. The flashing lights of the police car faded into the night as they drove away. Haunting on the midnight train, the town lay deep in the mountains, with old houses scattered about and streets filled with whispers of long-forgotten stories. One of those mysterious tales was about the midnight train. For many years, no one dared to board the train, but I was not like them. I was the kind of person who believed that fear was for those not seeking answers. On that cold winter night, I decided it was time to confront the truth myself. I arrived at the train station just before midnight. The platform was empty, the old wooden benches creaking under the weight of the cold wind. Flickering lights cast strange shadows. The ticket counter was manned by an elderly station master, his eyes glancing at me with a mix of concern and pity.
"Are you sure about this, son?"
I nodded, smiling confidently at him. "It's just a train ride. I'll be back." The station master sighed and handed me the ticket. I caught a glimpse of him muttering a small prayer as I walked toward the platform. The slow minutes dragged on as I waited. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the town was holding its breath. Then, in the distance, I heard the whistle of a train, its headlights slicing through the darkness like two eerie eyes. The train stopped before me, its peeling black paint and dirty, soulless windows. The door creaked open, inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, but then took a deep breath and stepped inside. The flickering lights cast long shadows across the old seats. The air was thick with dust and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. A feeling unnatural. As I walked down the aisle, I realized the train was empty. No passengers, no ticket collector, no signs of life. Strangely, I wasn't scared. Instead, I felt a thrill. I sat by the window, watching the small town fade away into the distance. At first, everything seemed fine. The train accelerated, speeding through the night, but after what felt like hours, I noticed something was off. The darkness outside the window was unusual, like a void. I glanced at the clock, only to see the hands frozen in place. A sense of unease washed over me. The light above me flickered violently before plunging the train into complete darkness. I held my breath. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use it as a flashlight. But when I pressed the screen, it remained black, completely unresponsive. Panic set in. Suddenly, I heard it, a whisper.
Jacob.
My heart skipped a beat. I froze, trying to listen. The voice was faint, barely above a breath, but it was there.
Jacob, come to me.
I turned around, but the car was empty. The whispers grew louder, closer. I hurriedly stood up and stumbled, trying to find the ticket collector's car. When I reached the front, I found the car empty. Just an old, dusty uniform hanging on a hook. No one was there. The train shook violently, throwing me off balance. I clung to the seat to steady myself as the whole car seemed to tremble. The train was moving faster, dangerously fast. I reached for the control panel, hoping to stop the train, but it was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it hadn't been used in years. My fingers fumbled over the switches, but nothing worked. Then the whispers returned, growing louder, filling the air around me.
You can't escape, Jacob.
My blood ran cold. Those words seeped into my ears, chilling me to the bone. I turned to leave, but something held my feet in place. I looked down and saw an old pair of shoes still attached to a ghostly figure. It was pale, translucent, its face twisted in pain. Its hollow eyes stared at me. Then, more appeared. Ghostly figures emerged from the darkness, their bodies flickering like dying candles. They reached out to me, their cold, damp hands, their voices filled with sorrow.
Help us. Save us.
I tried to back away, but the shadowy figures closed in on me. Their icy hands brushed against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. Desperate, I pushed them away, their cries echoing in my ears. I needed to escape now. At the back of the train, I found a locked door leading outside. I pounded on it, shouting, but it wouldn't budge. Then, in the corner of the car, I noticed a faint light. I knelt down and lifted a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was an old, dust-covered journal. The journal belonged to the original train conductor. He described strange occurrences and ghosts. His final entry spoke of a curse, a train cursed to hold the souls of the dead on board, and there was only one way to break it, by confronting the source of the haunting and seeking out the mirror in the car to destroy it. Determined, I followed through to the back of the train. At the rear, I found a large, cracked mirror. Its surface shimmered with a strange energy. Looking into it, I saw the faces of trapped souls reflected in the glass, their eyes filled with sorrow. Its shape shifted and swirled. Terror engulfed me, but I couldn't let it win. I searched for something to break it, as if someone were hiding everything to stop me from doing this. I decided not to wait, reaching out with trembling hands, and punched the cold glass. The figure screamed a piercing scream as the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The ghastly shadows around me began to fade, their faces peaceful as they were finally freed. The train also started to slow down. I staggered onto the platform, my heart still racing, my body aching from the ordeal. The town, now bathed in the gentle light of dawn, returned to its quiet state. As I looked back at the train, it was now just an old locomotive. The station master was waiting for me on the platform, a pleasant smile of relief understanding what I had accomplished as he left. I nodded, too exhausted to speak, but grateful to be alive. I had freed the trapped souls on the midnight train, and I knew I would never forget the terror I had faced. The midnight train had become legend, but the memory of that night would stay with me forever. Mysterious masked person. The house was peaceful under the moonlight, and it seemed like it would be a simple summer week without my parents. They trusted me to take care of everything, and so far, I had been enjoying video games, staying up late, every kid's dream. Around 11 o'clock p.m., I was lounging on the couch, absorbed in my game. My phone buzzed beside me. A message from an unknown number popped up on the screen. Hi. I frowned. Who was this? I asked, but the reply came instantly, mixed with irritation and aggression. You don't know who this is? I tried explaining that I had just gotten a new phone and lost my contacts, but the angry messages kept coming. I assumed it was a prank and put my phone on silent, returning to my game. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but I was startled by a sound. A knock on the bedroom window. At first, I thought I was imagining it. It was late, and I'd been alone for days. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, I cautiously moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Nothing, just an empty yard. But I knew I'd heard something. I pulled out my phone, intending to call my mom, when I noticed several unread messages from the same unknown number. The last one sent chills down my spine. I'm here. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I immediately tried to call my mom, but the screen flashed, no signal. No way. We always had good reception here. I ran to the back porch and listened. Maybe, just maybe, someone was crying for help. I had years of self-defense training, and despite the fear surging through me, I was ready to defend myself. This could be a setup, a trick. I grabbed an old baseball bat from the garage and stepped into the backyard. The night was eerily quiet, which made me even more uneasy. I walked toward the edge of the trees, sweeping through the shadows. I shouted into the night, trying to sound confident, demanding who was there and telling them not to mess with me. Suddenly, a flashlight flickered, shining straight at me from deep in the woods. Whoever was holding it was too far for me to see their face, but they were trying to get my attention. The light went out as quickly as it had come on, and the screaming started again, this time more desperate. I slowly made my way toward the spot where the light had appeared. As I got closer to the trees, my heart pounded louder than my footsteps. The woods were dense, with towering trees casting deep shadows. I knew I shouldn't be doing this, but I couldn't stop. I yelled out, asking where the person was. A voice answered from somewhere ahead, a faint whisper saying,
Here, help me.
I stepped deeper into the woods. My grip tightened around the bat, and my legs felt heavy as I moved forward. I saw a figure. My voice trembled as I asked if it was the person calling for help. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it started moving. In a split second, I realized this wasn't someone tied up. This was someone alive, and they were running toward me. Panic surged through me, and something inside screamed at me to get away to save my life. I didn't know how, but I ran. I slammed the porch door behind me, locking it, then sprinted to my room, slamming the door shut. The knocking started again, first at the front door, then at the window. It was relentless, as if he was trying to break in from every corner. He wasn't playing anymore. He was hunting me. I heard the sound of glass shattering from the living room. My heart raced as I realized he was inside. Footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. He was looking for me. I hid behind the bedroom door, gripping the bat. I held on so tightly my knuckles turned white. The footsteps grew closer. I could hear his breathing just outside my door. The door creaked open, and I saw the wolf mask peeking out. He cautiously stepped inside, unaware that I was right behind him. In that split second, I swung the bat as hard as I could. It slammed into his head. He collapsed to the ground, and I didn't stop. I swung over and over until I was sure he wouldn't get up. The house was now quiet after the chaos. Inside, everything was still. The intruder in the wolf mask lay motionless on the floor, while I stood over him, panting, hands shaking as I gripped the bloodied bat. I stared down at the man, his body sprawled across the floor. The wolf mask, now cracked, still covered his head, hiding his face. For a moment, I froze, unable to process what I had just done. My phone still had no signal, but I needed help. I needed to get out of there. I rushed to the landline in the kitchen, my hands trembling uncontrollably as I dialed 911. I struggled to find the words, pressing the phone tightly to my ear, trying to calm down. I glanced back at the hallway leading to my bedroom, terrified that the masked man would get up again. The distant sound of sirens broke the silence of the night. Red and blue lights flickered across the walls as the police car stopped in front of the house. Their grim faces approached the door as I shakily opened it. The officers stepped inside, examining the broken glass, the signs of a struggle, and finally, the man lying on the floor. One officer knelt down, checking for a pulse. He said, "You did the right thing," as if he had seen this horror many times before. They told me to sit down and breathe, but I couldn't focus on anything except that mask, the wolf mask. Why? Why did he choose to wear it? The unconscious man was lifted onto a stretcher. His mask still hadn't been removed. My mind was still reeling from the events that had just unfolded. The next morning, I was at the police station. The officers asked me about the man, whether I had ever seen him before. I shook my head, explaining the messages, the strange knocks, and the wolf mask. Then, they told me his name was Thomas, and he had been on the run for years. A detective handed me a file filled with old newspaper clippings and photographs. The story they told me was chilling. Thomas had a disturbing past. Years ago, he had committed a series of home invasions in nearby towns. He would stalk his victims for days, learning their routines before making his move, and he always wore a mask to cover half his face. But it wasn't just any mask. The wolf mask had become his signature. In every report, survivors described the same thing. A tall man in a wolf mask, terrorizing families, always escaping before the police could catch him, until now. The final piece of the mystery was revealed when the detective, now more familiar with Thomas's case, explained why he chose the wolf mask. The detective slid a newspaper article toward me. It had a blurry photo of the wolf mask next to a headline that read, "Wolf Stalker Evades Capture." The detective said the wolf represented a predator, a cunning hunter. Thomas saw himself as the wolf, and his victims were the prey. It terrified me to think about how long he might have been watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had been toying with me, like a wolf plays with its prey. That night, back home, I sat alone in the living room, the faint hum of the TV filling the silence. My parents wouldn't be leaving me alone for a long time after this. The mystery of why he wore the mask had been solved, but the fear of that night still lingered. I didn't know if I would ever feel truly safe again, but one thing I did know, I would never forget the image of that cracked wolf mask lying on the floor. Stalked by the clown at the chicken shop. I was working full-time at a chicken shop. Not exactly the job I wanted, but it was enough to get by. Most evenings, I survived on leftover chicken, and then that Saturday night happened. It had been a long and exhausting day. The restaurant was packed from morning until late at night. As I was cleaning up, my feet aching, I noticed him sitting alone at a table in the corner, waving frantically. At first, I thought he wanted to order, so I walked over, trying to smile. But as I got closer, I realized he wasn't a normal customer. He was a mime, grinning widely, dressed in the classic black and white striped outfit, his face painted ghostly white. He didn't say a word. He just performed. I guessed he wanted chicken and fries, so I handed him the food without thinking much about it. I was too tired to care. His expression twisted with irritation the moment I gave him the tray. His grin morphed into a frown. He suddenly stood up and threw a few fake punches into the air like a boxer. Exhaustion overwhelmed me. I told him to leave, but his face darkened even more. Slowly, he raised his hand, mimicking the act of pulling something invisible from his back. He stared at me without blinking, slashing the air with the invisible object. I played along, pretending to throw an imaginary stone at him. He staggered back, clutching his head as if I had struck him, then dashed out the door. I laughed at the absurdity of it. I thought it was harmless, but I was wrong. That night, my colleague and I were walking home together. I told him about the mime, and we laughed as we walked. But as we approached the building, I saw something, or rather, someone standing in the shadows of the hallway. A figure, dressed like the mime. I froze, staring, but chalked it up to my tired imagination. A few days later, after another late shift, I stepped outside. I walked home alone, the cold wind biting into my skin. When I finally reached my apartment, I collapsed onto my bed, not even bothering to change out of my uniform. As soon as my head hit the pillow, the doorbell yanked me out of my restless sleep. Groggily, I dragged myself to the door and peered through the peephole. It was the colleague I usually walked home with. He wore his usual green beanie, but stood with his back to the door. I mumbled as I unlocked the door. "Did you forget something again?" But when I opened it, it wasn't him. It was the mime, his face painted ghostly white, grinning at me, his eyes gleaming with malice. He bowed and slipped past me without a word, heading straight for the bag of leftover chicken on my table. I stood there, frozen, as the mime rummaged through the bag. He pulled out a chicken leg, took huge bites, chewing slowly, savoring it like some twisted parody of a meal. Then his eyes lit up. He turned to me, mimicking the act of dipping fries in ketchup, grinning like a madman. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed over, snatched the food from his hand, and yelled at him to leave. His expression darkened. He slowly reached behind his back, pulling out the invisible knife he had shown me earlier. Only this time, it wasn't imaginary. Luckily, I reacted just in time, and it only grazed my arm, leaving a small cut. I bolted out of the room, blood dripping down the hallway. I could hear his footsteps behind me, faster, closer. In my panic, I fumbled with the buttons, desperately pressing the close button as he charged toward me. At the last second, the elevator doors closed. I collapsed to the floor, shaking, my vision blurred from pain and fear. The elevator doors finally opened in the lobby, and I staggered out, barely able to stand. My voice trembled as I called for help, and a passerby rushed over, eyes wide with fear. Someone had called 911. When the police arrived, after an hour of investigation, they told me they had searched the building but found no one matching my description, and the security footage had disappeared. He held up an evidence bag. Inside was the knife, but there were no fingerprints. They couldn't find him, but the weapon was proof that it had happened. After that, I moved away and quit my job. I couldn't step foot in that store again. But even now, I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, hands shaking, and every time I see him in the corner of the room, grinning, holding that bag of chicken. Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights where the air was still, and everything seemed eerily quiet. The large, suburban house, with its perfectly trimmed lawn, stood imposingly. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15 at the time, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was every kid's dream. A TV, a pool table, video games. It was the kind of place that made you forget the world outside, and we were living the dream. We lounged on a big leather couch, watching a horror movie on TV, munching on chips. Chase had started to doze off. I was struggling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety I often felt when sleeping over at a friend's house. But tonight, it felt different. It was much worse. It must have been past midnight when I heard it. A door creaking open slowly. I glanced over the back of the couch and saw something unsettling. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe just the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. Chase, wake up. The laundry room door. It opened by itself. Chase, groggy and half asleep, mumbled something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted that we go close it together. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch, falling asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. A while later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a sound that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an expression that was deeply unsettling. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed, a sound that shattered the stillness of the night. Chase jolted awake, his eyes wide with horror as he saw the man advancing toward us. In our panic, we ran. The basement had two exits, one leading upstairs to the front door, the other to a sliding door at the patio. In our terror, we split up. I ran for the patio while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping for breath, I quickly called the police, shouting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. The house was massive, and the silence was suffocating. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His scream, a desperate, terrified scream for help. I bolted up the stairs, my legs trembling. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man, the intruder, wrapping his hands around Chase's neck, choking him, his face twisted in a grotesque expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face flushed as he struggled to breathe. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy from Chase's room. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the back of the intruder's head. The man collapsed to the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air, but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There, we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had gripped him just minutes earlier. We sat in silence, too afraid to speak. I looked out through the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had ever happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. All I knew was that I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly walking across the yard, his movements deliberate. His sunken eyes stared straight ahead, almost robotic, as he made his way toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. He's coming. We both backed into the corner of the tiny treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder. Now I could hear him, crunching on the gravel path leading to the treehouse ladder. The creaking of the ladder made me jump with fear. He was climbing. I could feel the weight of him pressing down on the structure as the treehouse swayed with each step. Chase looked at me, eyes wide with terror. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox Chase's dad had left there months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, gripping it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the rod down with all my strength. The man let out a groan of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we scrambled down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind raced. Where could we go? The man had fallen, but he wasn't dead, and I knew it wouldn't be long before he got up again. Panting, I pulled Chase toward the side of the house, where thick bushes and overgrown trees hid us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, the sound of tires crunching on gravel. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood cautiously, peering around the bushes. The man was nowhere to be seen. I signaled to Chase to follow me. We darted toward the driveway as the police car came to a stop. Relief washed over me as two officers stepped out, immediately scanning the area. I shouted, "He's still here!" "He's..." Before I could finish, the man emerged from the shadows, appearing from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more deliberate. Blood dripped from a gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept walking toward us, his eyes locked on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing his slow, deliberate walk. And then, without warning, he charged at us in a terrifying sprint. A gunshot from the police tore through the night. The man staggered, collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. It was finally over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter, living in abandoned houses across the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found a crumpled old photograph. It was of Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to arrive. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It served as a reminder that real horror doesn't always come from the darkness. Sometimes it's standing right behind you, watching. The stalker in the Dunkin' Donuts parking lot. It was just an ordinary morning. My usual routine, a quick coffee stop at Dunkin' Donuts before heading to work. I don't go there every day, only when I feel like treating myself. Today, I decided to visit my usual spot. The store was busy, as expected, with the familiar noise of orders and chatter filling the space. I lined up, placed my order, and within minutes, I had my coffee in hand. As I stepped out of Dunkin', the sun was high, and the parking lot was crowded. People were rushing off to work, grabbing breakfast, nothing unusual, except for one thing. There was a man standing near my car. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, near the passenger seat, wearing a black coat, with his head slightly tilted as if listening to something. I tried not to think too much about it. People do weird things sometimes, right? Maybe he was just waiting for someone. I pressed the unlock button on my remote, the faint beep cutting through the quiet, and I headed for the driver's seat. The plan was simple. Get in, start the car, drive off. and forget about it. As soon as I got inside, an uneasy feeling ran down my spine. I put the key in the ignition, and just as I was about to start the car, the passenger door opened. The man got in. For a second, I just stared, frozen in disbelief. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring out the window. My heart raced. I didn't understand what was happening. I turned to him, my voice shaky. "I think you're in the wrong car." Silence. He didn't even acknowledge me. The tension was palpable. I said it again, louder this time. "You're in the wrong car." Still nothing. He just stared out the window, his expression blank, detached. That's when the fear set in. I told him to get out or I'd call the police. My voice was firmer now, desperate. And then it happened. Without warning, he turned toward me, glaring. His hand shot toward the ignition, and before I could react, he grabbed my keys. For a moment, we struggled. He held my keys in a tight grip, and before I knew what was happening, he swung at me, using the keys as a weapon. He swung it toward my face. I dodged, but I knew I had to get out of there. I pushed open the driver's door and bolted. I ran, gasping, panicking, not stopping until I was back inside Dunkin' Donuts. I grabbed my phone and called 911, barely able to explain what had just happened. Through the large glass windows of the store, I saw him driving off in my car, disappearing down the street. The next few minutes were a blur. The police arrived, took my statement, and I filled out a report, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. A few hours later, I received news. The police discovered my car by the woods in an empty state, and no one was in it. But something felt off. Even after I got my car back, the image of him sitting silently in the passenger seat, his vacant expression, lingered in my mind. Who was he? Why had he chosen my car? Weeks had passed since that strange man entered my car, and every visit to Dunkin' Donuts filled me with discomfort. Today was no different. I stood in line, ordered my coffee, and tried to convince myself that everything would be fine, that he wouldn't come back. It was early evening when I grabbed my coffee and stepped outside. I scanned the area, my eyes instantly locking onto a familiar figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was him. This time, he didn't have that vacant look. Instead, he stood there, head tilted, grinning eerily and waving at me as if teasing. A chill ran down my spine. My heart raced in my chest as I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Somehow, he didn't chase after me. Instead, he casually opened the passenger door and sat back inside my car with that same blank expression. This time, he didn't drive away. He just sat there, staring at me through the windshield as if waiting for something. I began to call the police. They arrived within minutes. I stepped aside, watching them cautiously approach the vehicle. The man remained still. He sat there, his emotionless eyes fixed ahead, oblivious to the events unfolding around him. One of the officers commanded him to step out of the car. For a moment, it seemed like he ignored their orders. But then, he slowly turned his head, his expression oddly calm. He opened the door and stepped out of the car, raising his hands as if surrendering. A few hours later, I sat in the police station, recounting the incident as if it was the 100th time. My arm still throbbed with old bandages covering the cuts from the key. They told me he had been arrested, and after taking his fingerprints, they discovered he had a long history of mental illness. His records showed he had been in and out of psychiatric facilities for years, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His delusions had worsened over time, and it seemed he had fixated on me for reasons no one could explain. They said he saw things, heard voices screaming incoherently when there was nothing around. They believed he couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was mixed with sadness. The man who had terrorized me was not just a criminal. He was sick. His mind had warped reality into something unrecognizable, and I had become part of that nightmare. As I left the police station, I couldn't shake the image of him sitting in my car, staring out the window, detached from the world. He had been arrested, and the officers assured me he would be taken back to a mental facility where he could receive the treatment he desperately needed. But the scars he left, both physical and mental, would take much longer to heal. I stood next to the car, hesitating to open the door, reluctant to sit in the driver's seat where everything had happened. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to unlock the door and get into the driver's seat. I started the engine and drove out of the parking lot, determined to move forward. After all, everything was finally over.